Pardon? Yeah, this one. Yeah, I want, we're not in session now, by the way, but I want folks to know that we've got to get through this so Tess can get out and do some shopping.
Well, then, by all means, let's move. Yes.
But I don't see everybody here from there. Hey, look, I was only getting the, we've got some members of the board here who agree with you entirely. Yes. Do you recommend we go to 27? Okay, we will stay with 27 then and go back to 24. I started 27 before, but we will begin it again. O'Neill's Beverage Company, LLC, Reedley Winery, Fresno County. This is the time and place for a hearing to consider revision of waste discharge requirements in a new cease and desist order for O'Neill Beverage Company's Reedley Winery in Fresno County. Is there anyone present who is contesting the proposed actions and wishes to present evidence or testimony on this matter? Yes, and I didn't see you before, and that's when we went to lunch. Good. Since there are persons present wishing to contest this item, we will proceed with a hearing. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published for the meeting agenda. At this time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. All persons expecting to testify, please stand at this time, raise your right hand, and take the following oath. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, I do. Thank you very much. The total times allowed for testimony and cross-examination are as follows. Regional Board staff, 25 minutes. O'Neill Beverage Company, 10 minutes. All other persons shall limit their testimony to 3 minutes, and a timer will be used. Please state your name, address, affiliation, and whether you've taken the oath before testifying. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
No, just to note that Ms. Kipps was granted 5 minutes.
Okay, so noted. Thank you. We'll now begin with the staff presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair Longley, members of the board. My name is Dale Harvey. I'm a senior engineer from your Fresno office, and I've taken the oath. Before you are a proposed set of waste discharge requirements, or WDRs, and cease and desist order for discharges of winery wastewater from the O'Neill's Beverage Company, Reedley Winery, to land. Today I will give you a brief history of the site, discuss legacy groundwater degradation and pollution issues beneath the site's land application areas, and describe the requirements of the waste discharge requirements and cease and desist order. I will also address comments that we've received on the waste discharge requirements and cease and desist order. As shown here by the red dot, the winery is approximately 16 miles southeast of Fresno, just west of the Kings River near Reedley. Winery operations include the crushing of grapes, the fermentation of wine, the distillation, and bottling of the wine products. Wastewater includes wash water and stillage wastes, which are combined prior to discharge. The winery has been in operation since at least 1950. The white arrows on the slide here show the main winery buildings as they exist today. Discharges are regulated by waste discharge requirements issued to Hublin, Inc. in 1995. These existing waste discharge requirements authorize the application of winery wastewater and stillage to a 37-acre land application area outlined here in red. Waste historically have been applied by flood application to disposal checks. Application rates have been high, and because the method of application and the coarse nature of site soils, loading rates have likely been uneven. Hublin sold the winery to Golden State Vintners in 1995. In about 2000, Golden State Vintners submitted a report of waste discharge to expand the land application area to about 106 acres, as shown here outlined in yellow. As shown, the 106 acres also includes the original land application area. In 2001, Golden State and Vintners segregated its high salinity waste streams, such as ion exchange regenerant and boiler blowdown, from its discharge to land and began discharging them to a lined Class 2 surface impoundment, shown here in blue and outlined in white. These discharges are regulated under separate waste discharge requirements. O'Neill purchased the winery in 2004 and in 2011 submitted a report of waste discharge for increased winery operations, an annual discharge flow of 80 million gallons, and expansion of the land application area to at least 156 acres by adding the area I just clicked in on green. O'Neill also has 50 acres west of Lackjack Avenue that could be used for land application area, shown here in white, and is in the process of purchasing or has purchased 139 acres of additional land outlined here in blue. This table presents average wastewater quality and flows for the non-crush and crush seasons, the latter of, or crush stillage season, the latter of which runs generally from August through November. The averages are based on data from January 2008 to December of 2012. Organic matter concentrations as measured by biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD, are high. Also, average flows and total nitrogen and potassium concentrations are significantly higher during the crush stillage season. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the impacts that historic discharges have had on groundwater. As I mentioned, site soils are coarse grained. Groundwater is about 40 to 60 feet deep at the site. The larger light blue arrow shows that the direction of groundwater flow is predominantly to the west-southwest. The smaller arrow is there to indicate that this flow direction is variable and in some cases does actually reverse due to either localized pumping or low river stage. The light blue line running through the site is an unlined canal that carries very high quality surface water when it's available. The monitoring wells shown here in yellow are in or near the original 37-acre land application area and have been impacted by historic discharges to the site. Generally, the wells exceed drinking water maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, for electrical conductivity, or EC, total dissolved solids, or TDS, and manganese. They also contain high concentrations of bicarbonate, ammonia, and total organic carbon, or TOC. These conditions are indicative of organic overloading to the original land application area. The wells are also high in potassium, indicating that this constituent has also been overapplied at the site. As you move away from the original land application area, in general, the groundwater conditions improve. Specifically, the wells shown here in green have lower levels of EC, TDS, manganese, bicarbonate, total organic carbon, and potassium than those associated with the original land application area. However, nitrate as nitrogen in these wells exceeds the primary drinking water MCL of 10 milligrams per liter, and the wells contain little or no ammonia. This may be a sign that the ammonia we see in groundwater under the original land application area has converted to nitrate as it has moved away from the area where organic loadings were excessive and groundwater exhibits reducing conditions. The remainder of the monitoring wells around the site are shown here in white and generally meet water quality objectives. The two exceptions to this statement are monitoring wells 10 and 11. These wells do have high levels of EC, TDS, and sodium. However, given the differences in water chemistry, distance from where wastes have been applied, and better quality of water in wells closer to the land application area, we do not believe these conditions are associated with winery operations. To address the issues associated with the overapplication of waste and resulting groundwater degradation and pollution, O'Neill proposes to expand its land application area from 106 acres to at least 156 acres. Double crop the land application areas to maximize nitrogen, potassium, and salt removal. Apply wastewater using sprinklers for more even waste distribution and loading. Supplement wastewater irrigation applications with high-quality surface water when it's available, and continue to divert high salinity waste to its line surface impoundment. In addition, the proposed waste discharge requirements cap the permissible flow of wastewater to 80 million gallons per year. To ensure that organic overloading does not contribute to existing groundwater problems, the WDRs also limit the weekly cycle average BOD loading rate to 100 pounds per acre per day in the original land application area where groundwater has been polluted, and 150 pounds per acre per day in the newer land application areas. The WDRs also require hydraulic and nutrient loading, including nitrogen and potassium, to be at reasonable agronomic rates to facilitate uptake by crops. O'Neill must demonstrate this to be the case through the development and implementation of a nutrient and wastewater management plan that will be subject to executive officer approval. The WDRs set specific groundwater limitations that prohibit the discharge from causing groundwater to exceed a nitrate as nitrogen concentration of 10 milligrams per liter, which, as I said, is the primary MCL, and the groundwater EC from exceeding 900 micromoles per centimeter, which is the lower recommended secondary MCL for EC. To ensure that ongoing discharges are consistent with the described requirements, the WDRs also require soil monitoring and the monitoring of the quality of percolate that percolates below the land application areas to groundwater. Staff believes that the management practices proposed by O'Neill and the restrictions imposed by the waste discharge requirements will, going forward, abate groundwater degradation by the discharge that rises to the level of pollution. However, we also recognize that O'Neill will have trouble complying with several of the limits in the waste discharge requirements, especially during the crush stillage season. There is also the issue of pollution caused by the historic discharges to the original land application area. Therefore, the WDRs are accompanied by a cease and desist order. The cease and desist order puts O'Neill on a compliance schedule that requires it to identify and implement measures such as additional treatment of its waste or further expansion of its land application areas to comply with the limits in the waste discharge requirements. O'Neill must complete this process within 4 years. The CDO also requires O'Neill to assess the horizontal and vertical extent of groundwater degradation and pollution caused by discharges to the original land application area. It must complete this task within 3 years and show through annual reports that it is making satisfactory progress toward meeting the groundwater limitations in the waste discharge requirements. Staff believes the combination of waste discharge requirements and cease and desist order provide O'Neill a way to move forward while addressing legacy conditions of groundwater degradation and pollution, which were caused in part by previous owners of the property. We've received comments on the proposed waste discharge requirements from Kennedy Jenks Consultants on behalf of O'Neill and Ms. Joanne Kipps. Our full responses to those comments are included in your agenda package. It is our understanding that O'Neill does not intend to contest the waste discharge requirements or the cease and desist order at this time. So I will focus on Mrs. Kipps's comments. In her comments, Ms. Kipps states that the high concentrations of some constituents in groundwater beneath the original land application area, particularly potassium, indicate that the historical discharges have used up the soil's assimilative capacity and that the continued application of waste to this area would only exacerbate conditions of pollution beneath the site. Ms. Kipps suggests that the board prohibit discharge of wastewater to the original land application area. We do not believe that that is necessary at this time. When applied to land, waste constituents are removed by many different mechanisms, having both physical and biological components. Larger solids can be removed by simple filtrations. Cations can absorb to soil particles, and organic matter can be cycled through biological organisms. Nutrients such as nitrogen and potassium can be taken up by crops if they are grown in the land application area. The efficacy of such a system is fluid and can change with changing conditions. There is no evidence that the, quote, assimilative capacity of a soil once exceeded cannot be reclaimed through modification of management practices. The proposed waste discharge requirements require organic loading at much lower than historical rates. Application of wastewater and nutrients at rates that can be uptaken by crops, and soil percolate monitoring to ensure that these conditions are sufficient to protect groundwater from further pollution. If the monitoring shows that these measures are not adequate, the cease and desist order requires O'Neill to identify and implement additional measures necessary to protect underlying groundwater and demonstrate progress towards compliance with the groundwater limitations in the waste discharge requirements. Given these restrictions, there should be no reason to cease discharge to the original land application area. In her comments, Ms. Kipps also states that the board should not allow O'Neill to increase flows until it has provided sufficient technical justification that the discharge will not exacerbate existing groundwater degradation and pollution. Ms. Kipps also states that the tentative WDRs do not require O'Neill to implement best practicable treatment or control of the discharge to minimize the degradation of groundwater. With respect to authorized flows, as shown here in the table, under its existing waste discharge requirements, O'Neill could discharge much more than the 80 million gallons per year allowed by the proposed waste discharge requirements. With respect to best practicable treatment or control of the discharge, the project incorporates in part the following treatment and control measures: expansion of the land application area, maximized use of available land to reduce loading rates, segregation and discharge of high salinity waste to aligned impoundment, screening and proper disposal of wastewater solids, flow limits, reduced BOD loading rate limits, hydraulic and nutrient loading at agronomic rates, sprinkler application of waste for even controlled distribution and loading, double cropping of land application areas to maximize the uptake of waste constituents, supplemental irrigation with high quality water when it's available, implementation of a nutrient and wastewater management plan, comprehensive monitoring of the discharge, land application areas, and groundwater limitations that prohibit the discharge from causing further pollution. Staff believes that implementation of these measures will result in best practicable treatment or control for the discharge occurring at this specific site. In her comments, Ms. Kipps also suggests that the board issue a cleanup and abatement order, or at least mention California Water Code section 13304 in the cease and desist order. The primary reason for this suggestion is so that staff can sign the site up for cost recovery to recover costs associated with the review of groundwater characterization and assessment reports associated with the cease and desist order. As mentioned, the cease and desist order requires O'Neill to assess the horizontal and vertical extent of groundwater degradation and pollution beneath the site and demonstrate the groundwater conditions beneath the site will come into compliance with water quality objectives within a reasonable time frame. O'Neill is paying annual fees that are supposed to cover the costs of regulating the site. If O'Neill is not making satisfactory progress towards compliance with the CDO, the board's enforcement group can at a later date issue a cleanup and abatement order and enroll the site into cost recovery. So in summary, we believe the groundwater issues at the site are in large part legacy issues. The proposed waste discharge requirements should end this legacy. They require more stringent loading limits, implementation of better wastewater management practices, and more comprehensive monitoring than required by the existing waste discharge requirements. The proposed waste discharge requirements are accompanied by a cease and desist order that requires further groundwater characterization and mitigation and compliance with the waste discharge requirements. We do have a late revision associated with the waste discharge requirements, and it simply corrects an assessor parcel number in finding 4 of the waste discharge requirements. My understanding is that that was sent to you. If it wasn't, I have copies available. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation. I would recommend that the board adopt the waste discharge requirements with the late revision and the cease and desist order as proposed. I would like to enter into the record my presentation and testimony and the regional board file on this matter. And I'll entertain any questions that you might have.
Any questions by board members? Thank you very much. Who is representing O'Neill Beverage? Sir, could you maybe come up and sit forward here while we're going through this item? Do you wish to cross-examine staff? Then I'm ready for your presentation. Good question. Have you taken the oath, sir? Thank you.
You need my address?
When you get up, if you could introduce yourself, give us your address,
Okay, that's great, thank you.
your affiliation. So
Hi, my name is Matthew Towers. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for O'Neill Vintners and Distillers. My address is 6775 North Haslam, Fresno, California. I know my time is limited.
Be real close to that mic because
sorry.
You can pull it a little bit more towards you maybe. Thank you.
Said I know my time is limited, so I'd like to introduce myself and make a brief statement. Like I said, my name is Matthew Towers. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for O'Neill Vintners and Distillers. On behalf of O'Neill Vintners, we would like to thank the Regional Board staff for their hard work in developing these new orders for our Reedley Winery. We believe the orders recommended to you by staff impose requirements that are protective of groundwater quality and that are achievable. We respectfully request that you approve staff's recommendations with your approval, and we are committed to meeting these new and additional requirements. That commitment includes performing studies to assess the impact of ongoing and historical practices at the winery, and if those studies determine that further steps are needed, we will take those steps, as O'Neill is dedicated to sustainable operations that are protective of the environment, including the groundwater. And now I'd like to turn it over to Kennedy Jinks for the balance of the presentation for a brief explanation on how O'Neill puts the dedication and commitment into practice.
Thank you, Madam Chairman Longley and Board. My name is Bob Kroback. I'm a consulting engineer with Kennedy Jenks Consultants. My company address is 303 2nd Street, Suite 300 South, San Francisco, California. And I apologize if I all of a sudden drop silent. I'm losing my voice, in which case I'll have my colleague Alicia Stamps try to finish off if I can't make it. Let me see here, page. Okay, how do I advance here? There we go. So we support, again, for our review and the hard work that the regional board staff has put into this, we support the WDR and CDO as drafted. I'd like to comment on a few of the ongoing improvements that O'Neill has been employing. They have, over the last 5 years, purchased on the order of $4 or $5 million worth of enhanced solids removal equipment for their processing. That allows them to remove solids before they do their distillation process. Therefore, those solids do not end up in the land application area. They are committed to continuing to screen before the land application of processed wastewater, and we will be looking as part of this ongoing studies to make sure that the existing screening is adequate for future flows. They are ongoing, looking at stream segregation. As we said, they have a surface impoundment that's double-lined. We will look at opportunities to divert streams that have low organic content but high salinity into that basin. That will reduce the load on the land. All of the land that they will potentially be adding for the land application area, we will look very closely at continuing with the sprinkler irrigation concept to allow for more equal uniform distribution. That will also allow for more frequent and smaller applications of the wastewater, promoting degradation by the microbes in the soil environment. We will double crop, allowing for nutrient uptake and salinity uptake to the extent the crops will do that. That is also one thing we would like to continue in the existing 37-acre area to reclaim that soil with the process of growing crop and lighter loads that will help to restore that soil. As I said, the O'Neill has purchased additional land. They have, I believe, another 72 acres that are about to close in escrow and 62 prior to that. So we are committed to implementing ongoing BPTC measures and improvements going forward. We did want to comment that the science supports the staff's BOD recommendation. Historical guidance was based on some early studies and surveys by EPA in 1977. It cited some ranges from 100 to 600 pounds per acre per day as acceptable BOD loading rates. Later, the wine industry, through the Wine Institute, Metcalf and Eddy did a observation of the then operating distilleries in California, and that cited a 750 pounds per acre per day BOD. That was later adopted into the basin plan as an amendment, and that is currently the basis for their existing WDR. And we wanted to point out, and staff acknowledged, that there have been some more recent guidance along these lines, including a pretty intensive Wine Institute study over multiple years, where we again looked at a range of loading rates and documented what the percolate quality would be and what the BOD removal efficiencies were. And in addition to that, the California League of Food Processors has also done some recent work along those lines, in indicating that, again, you can have higher loadings, and particularly if you're good about getting uniform distribution, and you can increase the loading as a result. So again, we believe the WDR and CDO, as drafted, require data collection and demonstration studies that we're committed to doing, and that'll be used to justify the appropriate loading rates. And then if there's any questions for that I might be able to answer, or O'Neill.
Jenny?
Yeah, you mentioned that, you mentioned that O'Neill has purchased new land that could accept wastewater. Is the intention of that new land to accept more wastewater, or is it to allow more commingling with the fresher the canal water? So there's less distribution of the wastewater throughout, or is the plan to actually increase waste flows with that new land?
Well, the plan would be to optimize the land application of that wastewater. So once we look at the topography and the characteristics, because we're going to do some evaluation of that land, looking at the existing soil quality, we will assess what's the best way to apply, and we would be maintaining no more than the 150 pounds per acre per day BOD loading rate. And depending on the crops grown in the area, we would rely on, again, the same combination of processed water, but also the requirement for supplemental irrigation water, because the facility does not generate enough water to grow crops on all the land. Yet it requires supplemental irrigation water. So I hope that answers
Yes,
the
it
question.
seems like it could be a combination, that the new land
That's
could
correct.
be also used for growth, for potential expansion of the facility.
I don't
but
think the new
also-
land will be for growth of the
Okay.
facility. I believe that would occur closer to the existing facility.
Okay.
Is that correct, Matt? Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any further questions? Thank you very much. Does Discharger have any further comments? Then does Regional Board staff desire to cross-examine? No cross-examination. Then we'll go to interested parties. Joanne Kipps.
Good afternoon, members of the board, Dr. Longley. My name is Joanne Kipps, and I have taken the oath. I reside at 1568 East Loftus Lane, Fresno, California. I'm a civil engineer who used to work at the regional board for about 12 years before I retired. I request that the board revise the WDRs as follows. 1. Prohibit discharge to the original 37-acre land application area where decades, possibly over 100 years, of its use for winery wastewater disposal have polluted groundwater for EC, TDS, and manganese, and caused groundwater total organic carbon levels to be double or triple background, and ammonia to exceed 25 milligrams per liter. Background potassium is generally less than 6 milligrams per liter, but in the polluted groundwater underneath the original area, it ranges from 100 to 300 milligrams per liter, which makes it a major contributor to the EC and TDS pollution. As far as I could read from the tentative CDO, it also states that there's no assimilative capacity for potassium in the soil and the groundwaters, particularly in this area. And it also says that the discharge's potassium loadings will likely exceed the crop uptake. Because the discharger has not submitted any kind of information showing otherwise, the board should find that the soil column in the original 37-acre area is so saturated with potassium that under natural precipitation, potassium will continue to be released to groundwater at rates that will cause or contribute to the EC and TDS pollution. This condition alone is sufficient for the board to require the whole area to be capped to retard rainwater infiltration, let alone to prohibit discharge. The discharger, which claims to be the 8th largest winery in the United States, has purchased adjoining parcels that the tentative order depicts as potential future land application areas. It seems to me that it can readily discharge to these areas and cease discharge to the original 37-acre area. 2. Revise the newly added finding 29 regarding the Wine Institute study by inserting at its end the following statement, which is adapted from the State Board-sponsored peer review. The study results also show the possibility of significant leaching of nitrogen and BOD beyond 5 feet that would be exacerbated by natural precipitation. 3. Revise finding 74 to classify the discharge as a Category 1 threat to water quality for annual billing purposes. Past discharges have polluted underlying groundwater to the extent that even if the discharge were to be discontinued tomorrow, it will take a long time before the high-quality Kings River water can dilute that pollution so that beneficial uses are restored. The board should ask staff for site-specific evidence to support its assumption that the discharge authorized by the WDRs does not threaten to contribute to this pollution. Lacking such evidence, the board should classify the discharge as a Category 1 threat to water quality, subject to EO revision, to Category 2, if and when the discharger provides site-specific evidence that demonstrates that the new discharge practices will not contribute to the pollution and or until underlying groundwater meets water quality objectives. Okay, and this is regards the cease and desist order. The work of Task 3, namely groundwater pollution delineation and remediation, is typically required by a cleanup and abatement order issued pursuant to Water Code Section 13304. This Water Code section should be inserted into the tentative cease and desist order along with the associated CNA boilerplate so that the discharger can reimburse all staff costs associated with overseeing board-required CNA work. Staff argues that discharger could be issued a CNA order later if it fails to make satisfactory progress toward meeting water quality objectives. But in my experience, my 12 years at the board, in all likelihood, a CNA order will not be issued given the board's chronic resource limitations and current management priorities. This minor change in the tentative cease and desist order will allow the board to initiate cost recovery at the onset when the discharger starts doing this cleanup and abatement work. I thank very much the board for its time and consideration.
Thank you very much. Questions for Ms. Kipps? Thank you very much. I'd like staff to come back and address the issues that Ms. Kipps raised. I know they were covered already in the presentation. But first of all, the issue of lack of assimilative capacity that Ms. Kipps is stating in the 37 acres, and the issue of potassium there would be one thing that I'm asking you to address. And then secondly, the cost recovery measure stating the applicable statute or Clean Water Act paragraph and pertaining to recovery costs. So if you want to start with the first one, the 37-acre issue.
Excuse me. Well, what was the specific clarification you would like?
Well, no assimilative capacity, and I'd like you to address that and the issues that she discussed on the high potassium levels. I know you went through that already, but I'd like you to revisit that, please.
Well, I think that there's more than just a cation-anion exchange going on with a land treatment system. I don't think it's as simple as that. And we do have other sites where we have had similar issues and ratcheted back the BOD loading, organic loading, and salt loading in general, and seen improvements. So I don't agree that a soil column that's 60 feet deep is the same as, for example, a granular activated carbon treatment system that once all the acceptance sites are used up is done.
Well, you made some statements earlier concerning the fact, you had a slide on it, the various mechanisms that take place to remove constituents.
Right.
Has it been demonstrated that in fact that this site has been at least partially restored?
I don't think we can make that kind of statement at this time.
So why are you continuing loading to the site then?
Well, the loading would be at a rate that the crops could uptake it, and I think that's going to be O'Neill's biggest issue, is being able to reduce its potassium loading, not the organic loading. But again, they have to show the board and staff through this nutrient management plan that the loading rates will be such that they can be used by crops. If there is some residual left over and percolates to groundwater, it's going to be less than what has historically been allowed to percolate to groundwater, and there is no water quality objective for potassium. So while that is degradation, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cause pollution. If we can get the organic loading down so you have some other constituents that are migrating to groundwater, lesser loading in that respect, then the EC and the TDS should also come down. And we have seen that on at least one other site that I'm aware of.
Now, to go back to an earlier statement you just made, that the loading, is it my understanding that this order provides for the loading to be that which crop can uptake?
Yeah, reasonable agronomic rates.
Okay.
And they have to show us that. I'm sorry, Clay.
And Dr. Longley, let me add also, this is Clay Rogers, Assistant Executive Officer in Fresno, that a number of the different management practices, the requiring of a double cropping in order to increase that agronomic uptake, the use of sprinkler irrigation, because in the past we had flood irrigation on fairly long runs and very sandy soil that we think led to a very unequal distribution that created severe reducing conditions at the head of the field, probably with much lower loading rates at the toe of the field. Now with sprinkler irrigation and spreading that out, we anticipate that we should go back to more oxic conditions. The limiting the load is the recognition that we don't want to add any significant additional contribution from that 37 acres. But with these additional management practices and the idea that we're better overall to spread that load out over all the available acreage, if we were to take the 37 acres out, then it would lead to an additional load, which would increase contribution in those other areas. That we are better to have, at least into the foreseeable future, have a reduced load in this area, spread the discharge out a little bit more with very specific monitoring and assessment of that information to confirm that we're seeing the desired results and that we have the cease and desist order in place if we don't see what we're wanting, to get additional management practices in place if it's found that this is not sufficient to work our way back toward returning the beneficial uses of the water.
Any other board members want to weigh in on this issue?
If I could kind of sum up what the requirements are. The issue is those 37 acres that were used a bit too intensively for a long period of time. I think there's some dispute about how long that was used, but it goes back decades. What we're doing in the cease and desist order and waste discharge requirements are requiring two main components that are specific to that particular patch of land. One, the BOD limit is lower for that patch of land than it is for all the other land discharge areas, to the tune of 100 pounds of BOD as opposed to 150. The other component, and it's a component that's specified in the cease and desist order, is that we have a provision in the land application area specifications that prohibits or basically says that you have to discharge at reasonable agronomic rates. In the cease and desist order, within 6 months of issuance of the order, 6 months of today if you issue the order today, they have to develop a plan and submit it to us about how they're going to manage nutrients on that area to ensure that it's at reasonable agronomic uptake. We then will have a chance to review that and see if it makes sense to us, and then they're going to have to implement that shortly thereafter. So, you know, the alternative, there is the alternative to shut that 37 acres of agronomic land down, but the board would prefer to have the discharger prepare a nutrient management plan, live within the confines of the BOD requirements, and try to meet the water quality objectives that way.
Carmen, did you wish to speak?
Well, I was going to say that I found what Ms. Kipp said very persuasive, and so I was looking for a satisfactory response from staff, and I think I feel like I got one from the response from Clay Rogers. So, and certainly with clarification from Mr. Palupa, and then I'll look forward to a response to the cost recovery question that the chairman made as well.
Anyone else wish to speak to the site itself? 37 acres. Good. Let's go on to the cost recovery. Why are we not inserting appropriate language as was suggested by Ms. Kipps?
I can step in here as well. I think there's a lot of cleanup and abatement orders that are issued for pieces of property that aren't associated with waste discharge requirements. And for those, we enter those always into cost recovery so that the person responsible for creating the mess is paying for staff's oversight of the cleanup efforts. Here, it's less of a cleanup effort than it is coming into compliance with the new requirements of our waste discharge permit. And the waste discharge permit, you have to pay fees for it. Another aspect of Ms. Kipp's comments related to the changing the threat and complexity, which also increases the fees. So they're talking about two different areas in which we would increase the board's fees. Waste discharge permit fees aren't cheap, and they are designed to cover the cost of board reviewing monitoring reports, developing the permit. Sometimes it covers that, sometimes it doesn't. But those fees go to the state board and get distributed to the regional board in terms of the PYs that we get. So they are paying for us to take those monitoring reports and recover them. I think it would be problematic to issue a cleanup and abatement order just to recover costs from the discharger that may already be covered under our permitting program.
Thank you.
Could I just get I'm sorry, Carmen.
Go ahead, Bob.
A summary. the winery started discharging to 36.8 acres, they increased their operation and expanded their land application. Do they get increased changes in WDRs or need them for that expansion?
Yeah, I mean, they submitted a report of waste discharge and then we didn't act on it. And the expansion from 37 to 106 acres was tacitly approved by staff through a letter saying, yeah, you're creating groundwater problems. More land would be a good idea. So I guess if you're
I'm not
quite,
gonna go there.
Yeah, I mean, there are provisions. They did fulfill CEQA with the county through I believe it was a negative declaration that was promulgated. We do have provisions in the water code that say that if an entity submits a report of waste discharge is going to be in compliance with the basin plan, and with the expanded use, they're trying to come into compliance with the basin plan, that they can begin discharging under the requirements that they submitted. We certainly review that, and when we did review that, we tightened up those requirements a bit, and that's the order that you see here in front of you today.
Thank you. Any further comments by members of the board? Thank you very much. I don't have any other cards. Is there anyone else in the audience who wishes to speak to this matter? Staff could give me a closing, well, if O'Neill could give me a closing statement, and then we'll follow that up, closing statement by staff.
Again, I'd like to thank the board for all the time they've spent on this and all the hard work. We intend to comply with the order should you approve it, and do whatever monitoring and steps needed to make sure we remain in compliance with the order.
Thank you. Closing statement by staff.
I don't care.
Clay Rogers again. Just in the closing statement, I mean, this is a difficult situation. We've worked on this permit for a long time. We've worked a lot with the dischargers. We seriously considered the comments that we got. We think this is an appropriate move in the right direction with all the steps that are there. We do believe that it's best practicable treatment or control. There is an enforcement order here too, because we do have a significant problem out there that we need to make sure it gets resolved and fixed, although we're not going to be able to snap our fingers and have it done today. And for those reasons, we think that the waste discharge requirements with the late revision and the cease and desist order are the appropriate way to go. Staff does recommend that those be adopted as proposed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Executive Officer's recommendation.
We have a late revision, so, okay, okay, so, well, I agree with Clay's recommendation for the board. I just, in Member Schneider's comments, we have a number of facilities that have had this happen where they submit looking for expansion and then the board's been, due to resources, slow to respond. And unfortunately, there's been a couple cases where impairment and pollution have resulted as a result of that inaction. So we're trying to remedy that as much as we can. So it's my problem. Under the groundwater strategy, we're working diligently to identify those types of sites and activities so that we can at least get them under some form of an order more expeditiously. But I agree with Clay that this order will significantly reduce the loading to our groundwater, and we will see some positive results as a result of that activity, and we have the proper monitoring in place to make sure that we can react more quickly.
Thank you very much. I'll close the hearing. At this point in time, we should deliberate and vote on the motion. I'm open for discussion, or if someone wants to make an order, make a motion to adopt, that would be.
Well, I will. I think, I don't think that staff is going easy or giving O'Neill a quick way out. So I do think that what is proposed today is is a good fit. It seems clear to me that not only is staff's watching this, but then there's, eyes out there by Ms. Kipps and I'm sure others that are watching this. So, we appreciate O'Neill being committed to making sure that they follow through on this, and I'm sure that they will, and I'm sure that if they don't, there'll be appropriate action taken. And having said that, I would support, or I would move that we approve the items as were proposed in our packet with the late revisions.
So that's the waste discharge requirement and the cease and desist order with
Both-
late revisions.
Both
Yes.
of the items, yes.
Do I have a second? Aye. Sandra seconds. This is a, yes. Go
I
ahead,
just want to
Bob.
say, for me, this is mostly about moving forward. And I think I appreciate O'Neill hiring Kennedy Jenks to help them ensure compliance on this. I appreciate our staff's efforts to look at what's the best path forward to get where we want to be and eventually clean this up. So I appreciate the comments of Ms. Crupps.
Thank you, Bob. At this point, it's a roll call vote. Will you call the roll, please?
Mr. Snyder? Ms. Miraz? Ms. Ramirez? Ms. Moffett? Dr. Longley?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. That will take us to item 24 on the agenda. So now take things back in order. We may stop partway through this item for a brief recess. Very brief, considering the burden that's upon us. This is a, for the Basin Plan Amendment for diazinon and how you pronounce that? Chlorofyros? Chlorofyros.
Yeah,
Okay.
Carl, come on.
I'm going to call him DNC, I think. This is the time and place for a hearing to consider amendment of the Sacramento and San Joaquin Rivers Basin Plan to provide a program for control of diazinon and chloropyrifos. There we go. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. This time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. Following the staff presentation, the Sacramento Stormwater co-permittees will speak for 5 minutes, and then interested persons may speak for 3 minutes. A timer will be used. Please state your name, address, and affiliation before speaking. Does council have any legal issues to discuss at this time?
Not at this time. I would note that there was a late revision. I believe it's been circulated to you. We've had a couple other suggestions, so we'll probably discuss those when we're deliberating.
Good, thank you. We'll now begin with the staff presentation.
Good morning, Chair Longley and members of the board. I'm Danny McClure, a senior engineer in the Rancho Cordova office. With me is Tessa Foget, an environmental scientist also in our Rancho Cordova office. The purpose for today's hearing is for the board to consider adoption of the proposed Basin Plan Amendment for the control of the pesticides diazinon and chlorpyrifos and approval of the supporting environmental documentation. Here's an overview of my presentation. As I present, please feel free to stop me at any time with questions. I'll also stop a few times during the presentation to see if anything needs clarification. First, I'll give a brief introduction on the issues with these chemicals, the purpose for this proposed amendment, and where we are in the process. Then, I'll provide some background information on diazinon and chlorpyrifos uses, fate, and water quality impacts. I'll go over previous board actions addressing diazinon and chlorpyrifos and current concentrations. Next, I'll discuss the proposed Basin Plan Amendment and the new proposed regulatory approach for addressing impaired waters that has been revised since the previous draft amendment you saw. Finally, I'll summarize the comments we've received and responses to those comments. Diazinon and chlorpyrifos are currently used pesticides. They've been found in surface waters at concentrations that can be toxic to aquatic invertebrates, such as the water flea Cerodaphnia dubia, shown in this picture, which form part of the base of the aquatic food web. These pesticides have been a water quality issue in the Central Valley since the early 1990s. Diazinon and chlorpyrifos have been the subject of a number of past board actions. We have seen considerable improvements in the concentrations of these pesticides, but there are still a number of water quality impairments, meaning water bodies where these pesticides are exceeding standards. The Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act requires that the regional board develop basin plans with water quality objectives, programs of implementation for achieving water quality objectives, and required monitoring to be undertaken to determine compliance with standards. Clean Water Act Section 303D requires states to develop a list of water bodies that are not meeting standards, and in most cases requires the development of total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, for these water bodies. If the board can demonstrate that other pollution control requirements will successfully address an impairment, then a TMDL is not necessary. Currently, the basin plan doesn't have numeric water quality objectives for these pesticides in most water bodies, only narrative water quality objective. It also doesn't have TMDLs or other specific pollution control requirements for these pesticides in most water bodies. The purpose of the proposed amendment is to resolve current and future water quality impairments for diazinon and chlorpyrifos by establishing clear goals and a timeline for action through our existing water quality control programs. The proposed amendment would accomplish this by establishing water quality objectives, a program of implementation and monitoring requirements that apply to current impairments as well as potential future impairments. In this presentation, I'll use the term 303D listing or listing to refer to water quality segment pollution combinations on the 303D list. So an example of that would be chlorpyrifos in Lone Tree Creek would be a listing. One of our performance measures monitored by the state board is how much of our 303D list we've addressed, meaning we've established TMDLs or other pollution control requirements that meet the requirements for Section 303D. In Region 5, we have a total of 668 303D listings, shown in green. 62 listings have already been addressed through establishment of TMDLs, so those are shown in blue. Given the amount of listings that need to be addressed, we're always looking for ways to address impairments more efficiently, which is why we started looking at ways to address multiple listings at once. There are 58 listings for diazinon and chlorpyrifos in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. These listings are on 34 water bodies. Some of the water bodies are listed for both of them. The proposed amendment would establish new requirements that address 47 listings, so those are shown here in yellow. Another 11 diazinon and chlorpyrifos listings are proposed to be addressed through delisting, since concentrations are now meeting standards. Those are shown in orange. The proposed amendment also contains provisions to address potential future impairments from diazinon and chlorpyrifos so that they never have to end up on the 303D list. This table shows where we are in the process. There were a number of previous board actions on diazinon and chlorpyrifos in specific water bodies in Region 5 from 2003 through 2007, establishing water quality objectives, TMDLs, and implementation provisions. Instead of continuing to address individual impairments on a water body by water body basis, we started public scoping for a broader pesticide basin plan amendment to cover multiple water bodies in the Central Valley in 2006. We've held several stakeholder meetings from 2006 through 2014 in the process. We released a first draft basin plan amendment for diazinon and chlorpyrifos in water bodies throughout the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins in March 2013. The board had a comment hearing back in April 2013 on that. We had planned to bring this back to the board last spring for adoption. During that comment period, we received some comments and information that caused us to rethink the proposed approach. We made some significant changes in the proposed regulatory approach away from the use of TMDLs and towards addressing impairments using our existing state authority. We made some significant revisions to the proposed amendment and released the revised draft for public comments, for another round of public comments in January 2014. We also met with stakeholders to discuss the changes. What you have before you contains responses to all the comments and incorporates changes made as a result of these comments. If State Board adopts the proposed, if the board adopts the proposed amendment, it would then go to State Board for approval, then the Office of Administrative Law, and finally US EPA for approval before it becomes fully effective. Currently, diazinon and chlorpyrifos are primarily used as agricultural pesticides. Historically, diazinon and chlorpyrifos had significant urban uses, but almost all the sales of these pesticides for non-agricultural uses were canceled by US EPA in 2005 to reduce risks to children's health. A few non-agricultural uses remain in areas where children are not expected to be present. Diazinon and chlorpyrifos are used on several major crops in the Central Valley by about 2,500 growers in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. The highest diazinon use is applications to dormant orchards, stone fruit, and nut trees during the winter. Chlorpyrifos, on the other hand, is most heavily used during the irrigation season, with the most significant uses being on walnuts, almonds, and alfalfa. Diazinon use has declined drastically since the 1990s. Chlorpyrifos use has declined somewhat, but it is still heavily used. Looking at the environmental properties of diazinon and chlorpyrifos, they are not highly persistent, so the diazinon and chlorpyrifos we detect in the environment is all from recent uses. However, they are persistent and mobile enough to get into surface waters, and they are periodically detected in agricultural streams and occasionally, very infrequently, still detected in urban streams. The primary concern with these pesticides in surface waters is that they are toxic to aquatic invertebrates at low concentrations. Toxicity to aquatic invertebrates at the base of the food chain can affect food availability for higher species like fish. Another important property of these pesticides is that they have additive toxicity because they are both organophosphates and have the same toxic mode of action. This graphic illustrates the primary processes for the movement of these pesticides to surface waters. In this picture, pesticides are being applied to a dormant orchard in the winter. In orchards, the pesticide is generally sprayed from the ground by an air blast sprayer towed behind a tractor. Some can drift or volatilize and redeposit directly into surface water. And some of it can remain in the air until a rain event occurs. When it rains, pesticide residue in the air can be scavenged by rainwater, which can enter surface waters, and pesticides remaining on the trees or orchard floor can run off and be transported to surface waters. Pesticides also move off-site during dry weather. A similar scenario occurs during the dry season, but the pesticides move off-site via irrigation runoff or drift. In the early 1990s, these pesticides were detected at levels to aquatic invertebrates in samples from urban and agricultural areas throughout the Central Valley. As a result, a number of water bodies were placed on the 303D list for one or both of these pesticides. Also, numerous agencies, growers, researchers, and other stakeholders began working on ways to reduce the concentrations. The Central Valley Water Board has taken numerous actions to address these pesticides. These included establishing water quality objectives, TMDLs, and implementation and monitoring requirements for specific water bodies: the Sacramento and Feather Rivers, Sacramento County urban creeks, the San Joaquin River, and the Delta. All of these have compliance dates that have recently passed, and based on recent data, the adopted water quality objectives are being attained overall, although there are some scattered exceedances and water bodies where more data may be needed. The Sacramento and Feather Rivers and a couple reaches of the San Joaquin River were delisted for diazinon in 2010. These were featured as some of our success stories for improving water quality. The current status of diazinon and chlorpyrifos is that concentrations are much lower now compared to the early 1990s and appear to be declining in general. They're almost never detected in wastewater treatment effluent, and they're only very infrequently detected in urban stormwater. Detections and exceedances of criteria in agricultural streams are still periodically found. The Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program continues to work on these exceedances, and concentrations are going down. There have been several new listings in recent years, but these are the result of increased monitoring and assessment and not increasing concentrations. But we still have a lot of listings for these pesticides. Almost all the remainder would be addressed in the proposed amendment. I'll pause here for questions before I move on to the discussion on the proposed Basin Plan Amendment.
When you said it's occasionally still found in urban streams, how do you think it gets to urban streams?
There's a couple of ways that can happen. So the sale was banned in 2005, but there's still people who have stashes of it in their garage. There's also atmospheric transport that can happen, so it's can be present in the rain. And then there are still a few non-agricultural uses. They're very low amounts, but there are some that are allowed.
Any further questions or comments? Thank you.
This is an overview of the proposed amendment. It is similar to and builds upon our past Basin Plan amendments. The proposed amendment contains water quality objectives for diazonon and chlorpyrifos, implementation provisions to achieve those objectives, and monitoring requirements for dischargers so we can determine if the objectives are being met. It also includes provisions for assessing potential impacts of replacement products. The proposed amendment is different than past amendments in that it does not include TMDLs. And the geographic scope is expanded to address tributaries throughout the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins, including both impaired and unimpaired water bodies. This is the project area covered by the proposed amendment. The Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins below major dams around the rim of the valley, such as Folsom and Oroville. Shown by the dotted line. Sorry, the figure's a little hard to see. The area below these dams help define the lower foothills and valley floor. This is the area in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins where most of the diazonon and chlorpyrifos are used and all the impairments from these pesticides occur. The amendment proposes to establish numeric objectives in all water bodies with aquatic life beneficial uses and the impaired water bodies on the 303D list. This will provide broad coverage in terms of establishing objectives, which will provide a clear goal for water bodies throughout the project area and ensure specific 303D listings are addressed. Establishing objectives for water bodies that are not currently 303D listed will help any future impairment be readily addressed, as the numeric goal would already be established. This approach will allow the board some flexibility for dealing with constructed water bodies that do not have aquatic life beneficial uses designated, so this alternative should be compatible with future board projects looking at beneficial uses in constructed water bodies. The proposed water quality objectives are the diazonon and chlorpyrifos criteria that were calculated by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife using EPA methodologies. These numbers are in micrograms per liter or parts per billion, so low concentrations. The criteria have acute and chronic concentrations and an exceedant frequency of no more than once in 3 years. The proposed objectives are the same as the objectives currently established in the Basin Plan for the main stem Sacramento and Feather Rivers, San Joaquin River, and the Delta. Our analysis has shown that these objectives are both protective of beneficial uses and achievable. Both the US EPA and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife support the proposed water quality objectives. Management practices were identified that should allow growers to maintain productivity while reducing loads of these two pesticides to meet the water quality objectives. Briefly summarized, the numerous available management practices can be classified as pest management practices, pesticide application practices, vegetation management practices, and water management practices. Pest management practices include activities such as only applying pesticides when pest monitoring indicates that it is truly necessary, or use of less toxic pesticides and other practices to reduce pest pressure while reducing use of toxic pesticides. In addition, improvements can be made to the way pesticides are applied. For example, application equipment can be calibrated more frequently to minimize over-application. More precise application technologies are also available, such as smart sprayers. There are also practices to reduce overspray and drift that are required in existing pesticide labels and regulations, which are enforced by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation and county ag commissioners. Vegetation can be managed through such practices as cover crops and buffer strips, which can reduce runoff and decrease drift. Water management practices can include numerous more efficient irrigation systems and practices and management of drainage water, all of which reduce irrigation runoff. In addition to reducing pesticides concentrations, many of these practices have other beneficial benefits, such as reducing runoff of sediment, nutrients, and other pollutants, and reducing water use. The proposed amendment was designed to be implemented through existing regulatory programs such as the Irrigated Lands Program, waste discharge requirements, and NPDES permits for stormwater and wastewater dischargers in a way that integrates with their existing operations. A prohibition is proposed for unregulated dischargers discharging at concentrations above the water quality objectives. This helps ensure the objectives will be met and that unregulated sources can't cause compliance problems for other dischargers. This overall framework is consistent with the previous amendments adopted by the board for diazinon and chlorpyrifos. The proposed implementation provisions would require management plans from dischargers of diazinon and chlorpyrifos to describe actions the discharger will take to meet the water quality objectives. If the water quality objectives are not being met, then the executive officer can require revisions to the management plans. The proposed implementation provisions would also require management plans to be developed if future monitoring finds additional exceedances. Where representative monitoring is used, management plans would be required to address achieving compliance in all the represented water bodies. The proposed amendment relies on existing policy for compliance time schedules, but has a 10-year backstop for compliance following final approval for meeting the water quality objectives if compliance is not determined in state policy. Within that 10 years, it would be up to the individual programs, mostly irrigated lands, to set compliance timeframes in accordance with program priorities. We anticipate these will actually be addressed before then, since these pesticides are an irrigated lands priority. But this will give the board more flexibility to focus on priorities other than diazinon and chlorpyrifos where appropriate. There are 58 303D listings on 34 water bodies in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. The most recent data were reviewed for these water bodies to confirm the impairments before proposing specific pollution control requirements. Recent data indicate that 11 of these water bodies are now meeting standards, so for those, we're recommending that they should be delisted. New requirements in the proposed amendment would address the remaining 47 listings. As I mentioned earlier, 303D listings usually require TMDLs. However, when alternative pollution control requirements are in place that have both the force of law and are effective at eliminating impairments, this eliminates the need for TMDLs. Because diazinon and chlorpyrifos are primarily agricultural pesticides, they are being effectively addressed by the Irrigated Lands Program. Adding provisions to the basin plan that will require the board to continue these efforts eliminates the need for a TMDL. There are two reasons why we're proposing this regulatory path. First, the Irrigated Lands Program has a proven track record of controlling these pollutants. We see examples of this in the water bodies that were formerly listed that are now meeting standards. so it makes sense to build our control program around this existing model. Second, TMDLs ordinarily require the board to develop a permitting scheme to allocate load and waste load allocations. For diazinon and chlorpyrifos, this could mean developing a separate scheme to regulate the dischargers that are responsible for drift, volatilization, and atmospheric transport. We believe that it is preferable to instead focus on eliminating exceedances of water quality standards caused by agricultural activities by requiring agricultural dischargers to develop response plans and to implement management practices when standards are violated. This is the approach that is currently being implemented under the Irrigated Lands Program. By adopting the proposed amendment, the board will commit to using this method to address diazinon and chlorpyrifos impairments. This is a straightforward approach that doesn't really depart from existing requirements in other diazinon and chlorpyrifos TMDLs. Under both the proposed amendment and prior TMDLs, we established water quality objectives and implementation and monitoring provisions in the basin plan, and we demonstrate that these actions will result in meeting standards. Clean Water Act regulations allow states to remove listings from the 303D list without establishing TMDLs when they can demonstrate that existing pollution control requirements, in this case the Irrigated Lands Program, will resolve impairments. The listings are then moved from the 303D list to what's called Category 4B. EPA guidance specifies expectations for Category 4B demonstrations where we document moving a 303D listing to Category 4B. Appendix F of the staff report contains our draft Category 4B demonstration and shows how these elements are all part of our regulatory program that would be established with the proposed amendment. Moving these listings to Category 4B will be something that EPA will look at as part of updating the state's 303D list. We've discussed this draft Category 4B demonstration with EPA Region 9 staff, and we don't expect EPA would require that these listings be kept on the 303D list, given the program we will have in place.
I guess at this
Question?
point, before you go any further, are there any questions at this point? This is a long, lengthy presentation, so we can take it in bites rather than one whole slug.
I have one question. You mentioned EPA and working with state authority. What has been the work that you guys have done with DPR, or has DPR played a role in this at all?
Yeah, well, we have a managing agency agreement with DPR, and they get a chance to review proposed amendments. And DPR's done a lot of work on diazinon and chlorpyrifos too in the past that I presented a year ago. In the interest of shortness, I excluded that. Maybe I should have kept it in there. But they have dormant spray regulations that have done a lot, especially for diazinon. And so we continue to coordinate with them and work with them, and then they regulate the ag commissioners to ensure that, especially if something's happening as a result of a label violation, or to work with them to, continue to push them to make sure that the registration is considering protecting water quality as well.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that this effort that DPR had been involved in this as well. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other comments, questions? Go ahead and proceed, please.
As an example of the effectiveness of the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, this slide shows the concentration trend before and after a management plan was implemented in 2008 in the Duck Slough and Lone Tree Creek subwatersheds. Looking at the trends for chlorpyrifos and diazinon, and for the test organism Cerodaphnia dubia, water flea, which is most sensitive to insecticides, percent exceedances since the implementation of the management plan in 2008 are trending downward. There are additional management plans underway that are all having similar results. The proposed amendment contains monitoring requirements for dischargers to determine compliance with the water quality objectives. As in previously established programs, specific monitoring sites and frequencies are not proposed. Instead, monitoring is required to address a number of specific goals, including determining compliance with objectives and allocations, determining effectiveness of management practices, determining whether the discharge is contributing to an additive toxicity impairment, and determining whether alternative replacement products are impacting water quality. The proposed amendment would require that all impaired water bodies named for water quality objectives be characterized either through direct or representative monitoring. In developing the proposed amendment, potential costs were evaluated. For stormwater and wastewater discharges, additional treatment or other practices are not expected to be needed, so the only cost is the cost of monitoring, some of which is already required through those programs. The costs for agricultural are not additive with the costs already estimated for the irrigated lands program. Because the proposed amendment makes specific requirements in the basin plan, the costs of these requirements need to be quantified, but those expenses are already expected to occur as part of the irrigated lands program. The preparation of the proposed amendment also included an evaluation of potential environmental impacts and mitigation measures as required by CEQA. Some potential environmental impacts were identified, such as those that would occur as a result of construction associated with installing management practices and potential reduction in freshwater flows. Most of these impacts can be mitigated to less than significant levels, but some of the potential mitigation measures fall outside the jurisdiction of the regional board. Some potentially significant and unavoidable impacts were identified, such as the loss of some effluent-dependent freshwater habitat, but the substantial benefits to aquatic life and water quality were determined to outweigh the potential adverse impacts. I'll pause for questions on the proposed amendment before I move on to the discussion on the comments and responses.
I think you're good to go.
There have been a number of opportunities for public involvement in the development of the proposed amendment. We've had numerous stakeholder meetings throughout the development where we've discussed the proposed amendment, including detailed discussions of the amendment language. We have also circulated multiple early drafts of potential amendment language for informal comment. There were 2 drafts that went out for formal comments and responses. We received a total of 15 comment letters on those. The first draft was back in March 2013. We received 8 comment letters on that, and also oral comments at the board meeting. The second draft went out in January 2014, and we received another 6 comment letters. The staff report contains responses to all the comments we received within the 2 comment periods, and where appropriate, we made changes to the proposed amendment in staff report. Appendix D contains the responses to the comments on the March 2013 draft, and Appendix E contains responses to comments on the January 2014 draft. In those, we noted where we made changes in response to the comments. During the process, we heard from agricultural and related organizations, environmental and fishing groups, municipal and stormwater and wastewater and local government and state and federal agencies. Here are the agricultural and related organizations that have commented, including 4 coalitions. If you want to read all that. Here are the environmental and fishing groups that have commented. Here are the municipal stormwater and wastewater groups and local government agencies that have commented. And finally, the state and federal government agencies that have provided comments. We received 6 letters on the January 2014 draft. They were from the Central Valley Clean Water Association, or CIVICWA, which represents wastewater dischargers, Earth Justice, an environmental legal group representing 3 fishing organizations, the East San Joaquin Water Quality Coalition, the City of Roseville, and the Western Plant Health Association, which represents fertilizer and pesticide companies. Next, I will respond to the major themes of these comments and how we responded. Environmental and fishing groups commented that the program we proposed is inadequate, doesn't properly address drift and atmospheric transport, does not provide an adequate margin of safety, or specify enforcement measures. They also commented that a TMDL is required to address these impairments. Our general response is that the programs we have in place have been proven to be effective. The proposed amendment will establish requirements that will result in meeting the water quality objectives, and we have demonstrated that TMDLs are not needed. Civiqua commented that the amendment should contain revisions to the allocations in existing TMDLs that suggest permit limits are required even when these pesticides are not present at levels with the potential to cause exceedances in the receiving water. Staff's response is that we agree that effluent limits shouldn't be required if there's no reasonable potential, but that making this change is outside of the scope of this proposed amendment. The board can look into clarifying this language in the future. Agricultural and related organizations and the coalitions have questioned the need for the implementation requirements to be included in the basin plan. Our response is that these requirements provide clarity and for timely resolution of impairments, allow us to demonstrate that impairments will be resolved. The proposed amendment allows existing work products from the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program to be used to meet these requirements. We also have a late revision in response to this concern. We added an additional finding to the resolution that clarifies this amendment does not require additional information or revision to existing management plans beyond the process prescribed in the Irrigated Lands orders. Agricultural and related organizations commented that water quality objectives should not be proposed for constructed water bodies or other water bodies without designated beneficial uses. Staff's response is that the evidence in the board's files indicates that aquatic life beneficial uses exist in the water bodies which would have objectives established under the proposed amendment, including the 6 water bodies where beneficial uses are not yet specifically designated, and that it is necessary to establish objectives in these water bodies to resolve the listed impairments. Several organizations commented that the required monitoring will be a significant expense for them and that the associated costs were underestimated. There were also comments stating that monitoring for replacement products is unnecessary. Staff's response is that the monitoring requirements are flexible and allow for representative monitoring in programs that allow it. In addition, the cost estimates were revised in the staff report in response to information provided by the commenters. Monitoring for replacement products provides important information to the board regarding potential water quality impairments. Stormwater and wastewater dischargers have commented that proposed amendments monitoring requirements place an undue burden on local agencies who have no control over pesticide use, state and federal efforts, and that state and federal efforts should be the primary mechanism to address pesticide issues and monitor for pesticides in urban runoff. Staff's response is that local agencies have responsibilities under water quality law to ensure dischargers don't impact water quality, and it's the water board's responsibility to make sure that water quality is protected using our authorities.
Sorry, can you read that first point again?
On the response? Okay. Staff's response is that local agencies have responsibilities under water quality laws to ensure discharges don't impact water quality, and it's the water board's responsibility to make sure that water quality is protected using our authorities. The monitoring requirements were crafted to be flexible to allow dischargers to use existing monitoring efforts when data are available and to use collective monitoring efforts such as regional monitoring programs. Staff also added language to the basin plan based to the proposed basin plan amendment based on these comments, acknowledging the need to continue to coordinate with DPR and US EPA on regulation of pesticide use as one of the primary mechanisms for addressing these impairments. Discharger groups have commented on proposed compliance timeframes that they are too short and were not consistent with existing plans and policies. In response to these comments, staff has changed the proposed amendment to rely on compliance timeframes established in existing plans and policies, but contains a backstop of no longer than 10 years when compliance timeframes are not otherwise established. I'll stop here for questions on the comments and responses before I move on to my concluding remarks and comments from stakeholders.
Could you clarify the 10-year backdrop for me?
So if in the basin plan language, it says that if there's a compliance time frame established in existing law or policy, then we would use that. But if there's not, then so there's a compliance schedule policy for NPDS, for instance, that gives them 10 years. And so this is made to be just use that, but then if there's nothing, then we have a compliance time frame of 10 years, of no longer than 10 years.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Any other questions or comments? Very good. You go on to your conclusions.
To summarize, the potential amendment would build on our ongoing successful programs for the control of pesticide discharges. The amendment would establish water quality objectives and implementation provisions that would establish clear goals and a timeline for the control of discharges of diazinon and chlorpyrifos that can be implemented through existing regulatory programs. The proposed amendment would address all diazinon and chlorpyrifos impairments in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. It would also contain provisions so that any future impairments can be readily addressed, and contain provisions addressing potential replacement products. The development of the proposed amendment involved evaluation of alternatives, estimation of costs of compliance, and assessment of potential environmental impacts and related overriding considerations. The development of the proposed amendment involves significant stakeholder input, including circulating, discussing, and revising multiple early drafts of potential amendment language. The result is a proposed amendment which, when implemented, is expected to result in diazinon and chlorpyrifos concentrations meeting water quality standards throughout the Sacramento and San Joaquin River basins. At this time, I'd like to enter this presentation and the Regional Board's files for this matter into the record. With that, staff recommends adoption of the resolution with the late revisions. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, and then we'll hear from the public.
Any questions at this point? Very good. And next up will be the Sacramento Stormwater Co-Permittees. And as they come forward, or maybe it is one individual, we're going to take a short break, be back in here in as close as possible to 10 minutes after 2 to resume this item. Thank you.
And Dr. Longley, I do have some testimony that they weren't able to be here, but from US EPA, they wanted me to read a short statement for them, if that would be okay. Okay, thank you.
Into the record.
So yeah, I have a statement from Deborah Denton from the US EPA. Short, the EPA supports this basin plan amendment and these actions in this plan to reduce diazinon and chlorpyrifos. EPA supports the diazinon and chlorpyrifos water quality objectives and the science used to develop and support these objectives. EPA supports the application of the Regional Board's additivity formula for these same mode of toxic action pesticides.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Helps. So, I'm sorry, sir. A couple false starts there, but we're ready to go.
All right, great. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Armand Ruby, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Sacramento Stormwater Quality Partnership, which consists of the co-permittees of the Sacramento Area Phase 1 Municipal Stormwater NPDES permit. Thank you for providing us with this opportunity to comment on the development of this basin plan amendment. First of all, I want to acknowledge that the partnership greatly appreciates the time and effort that staff has invested in the stakeholder process for this project. It's gone on for some time, but we found the process to be very useful and informative. And we also support the board's decision to proceed with this basin plan amendment without creating a TMDL regulation, as we concur that the benefits, and of course, regulation of pesticide uses occurs at the federal and state level. It's a responsibility of U.S. EPA and California Department of Pesticide Regulation, DPR. Now, the water board staff here and also in the Bay Area do recognize the bind that this puts local agencies in. And for many years, municipal stormwater agencies have collaborated with water board staff in kind of a change from the normal way of doing business, but there's been a very productive collaboration in working with both DPR and US EPA to try to effect change in the way pesticide uses are regulated. And in fact, in 2012, that collaborative working of the stormwater agencies with the water board staff working in conjunction with DPR produced significant results when DPR adopted surface water quality protection regulations. This was a very significant occurrence and really is working in the right direction, we believe. The partnership also appreciates the inclusion within the Basin Plan amendment of a statement recognizing the importance of pesticide regulators in this process, and that statement reads, "The board recognizes that implementation of the authorities of agencies that regulate pesticide use, including DPR, US EPA, and county agricultural commissioners, should be one of the primary mechanisms for addressing pesticide-caused water quality impairments." And we agree, and we would simply say that those implementation of the authorities of those agencies should be the primary, not one of the primary mechanisms, but the primary mechanism for addressing pesticide-caused water quality impairments. So the big issue for local stormwater agencies now remaining in this Basin Plan amendment has to do with the monitoring requirements, and it's specifically, I'd like to draw your attention to items number 2 and 3 in the municipal monitoring section, which does cover both stormwater and wastewater agencies, and it's on page C9 of the proposed Basin Plan amendment. So is it still C9?
Yes, that's appendix C.
In Appendix C, right, so page C9. So we're looking at items number 2 and 3 down near the bottom of that page. And item 2 states...
Okay, can you hold on a second? Let
Yeah,
me
sure.
get there.
Right there. Go to the bottom, yeah.
What's the page on the bottom?
C-9.
Page 285.
Okay.
Bottom of the page.
All right.
All right, proceed. So item 2 states, to determine whether the discharge causes or contributes to a toxicity impairment due to additive or synergistic effects of multiple pollutants. And our concern with this is that the universe of potential multiple pollutants is enormous. And the determination of whether a toxicity impairment is caused by additive or synergistic effects of multiple pollutants really, we think, should be a function of the water board that's performed in the process of documenting a surface water impairment. We request that this provision be limited to known toxicity impairments as demonstrated within Clean Water Act Section 303D listings. So we're not arguing that we don't have responsibility to do monitoring to determine if we cause or contribute to an impairment, but we're reluctant to assume the responsibility that seems pretty open-ended with respect to all of the possible multiple pollutants that could come into a play. And pollutants which may be undefined. So our suggested rewrite would be 2. Where a Clean Water Act Section 303D listing indicates that aquatic life beneficial uses of a Table 3-2A applicable water body are impaired due to pesticide-caused toxicity, and where municipal stormwater or domestic wastewater discharges are listed as a source of the pollution causing the impairment, and where the water board has determined that the toxicity is due to additive or synergistic effects of multiple pollutants, determine whether the discharge causes or contributes to the toxicity impairment. So the things that I listed...
Just a second, sir.
Go ahead.
I'd like to have staff input on the suggested change.
Here, let me give it to you.
Yeah, I'm just seeing this for the first time, so
Yeah, we commented on this matter in the comment letter, but we didn't develop alternative language, so that's what we tried to do this time.
Mr. Bolívar, could you take a look at that language also?
I mean, generally, what the change I think would do, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be this requirement would then only apply once something was 303D listed for toxicity, whereas the requirement as in the original in the proposed amendment you have before you would apply to requiring toxicity monitoring just as part of their monitoring and reporting program.
I've taken a quick look at this, and thankfully Danny's our 303D list expert here. He's worked with that for quite some time. I think the concern that was meant to address by these provisions, and while I'm very sympathetic to the position that your agents, all stormwater agencies are in with respect to this particular item, is the fact that we're trying to make sure that by imposing this regulatory program, we're not pushing people to other pesticides that might be worse for water quality. And so we want to include provisions for monitoring for other types of toxicity and alternate pollutants. Those monitoring provisions, of course, would be constrained by the regulations pertinent to NPDES discharges and MS4 discharges, and that's why we tried not to be so specific with respect to these provisions here. We have some additional language possibly to be discussed later to also, we've added language that says we can discontinue diazinon chlorpyrifos monitoring upon showing that it's not creating a problem. We were also considering adding some language in there about alternative pesticides, and alternative toxicity could be discontinued if you're not seeing that either. But I think at this initial stages, we feel that that's an important part of the project to make sure that we're not displacing diazinon chlorpyrifos only to replace it with something that's even worse for water quality.
Could I take just a moment to respond to that? Thank you for looking at that. Would that be okay if I just address that before going on?
I need to pull the board. Is the board satisfied with Patrick's explanation, or you?
The ship's already,
Right.
the train's left the station on that one. Yeah, so diazinon and chlorpyrifos are already banned in urban areas. So we already have replacement pesticides. And so, and again, these permittees have no control over who does what with pesticides, and the replacements are already in use. So what we're trying to do is get this provision focused in on responding to impairments, and that we think is reasonable, and we'd accept that.
I'm hearing it already. It would have to be 303D listed before the requirement could be made effective.
That's our proposal.
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, and not to go too far outside of where the board's going on this, but there is some language already requiring toxicity testing where appropriate for some of these discharges. I would actually suggest removing this particular provision as opposed to inserting this new language, because the new language does imply that you'd have to have a hit on the 303D list before you start testing for it. We could just instead eliminate this provision, fall back on the traditional NPDES MS4 provisions. I do think, and I think that's for provision 2. Provision 3, which deals a little bit more about focusing in on replacement pesticides, and I think that there is an opportunity for, highway medians and golf courses still use diazinon chlorpyrifos. They're still authorized in those areas. So there is a potential for alternate pesticides to come in and in those areas. So I think the rationale is still in place for that. But number 2, rather than insert the 303D list as a trigger, I think we'd have to huddle up here, but I think you'd almost want to eliminate that provision as opposed to adding that language. And with respect to number 3, keep that in place, but add language that also says the same thing as it does right now for discontinuing diazinon chlorpyrifos impairments when that's not an issue, then that's proven not to be an issue in your discharge.
Yeah, we would be agreeable to that resolution because we agree that the process of the NPDES permitting does, on a recurring basis, allow for the board to require different types of monitoring.
So we have a resolution of this to leave 3 in place but to delete 2. Is that acceptable?
I would, so my final comment, other than saying one more nice thing, was going to be, which, so your staff has done a really good job on this, and it's been a good, we've worked well. But I would like to comment on number 3, if I may, which is, right now it says, determine whether alternatives to diazepam and/or chlorpyrifos are being discharged at concentrations with the potential to cause or contribute to exceedance of water quality objectives. And the problem again here is that could be perceived as being extremely open-ended. The alternatives are manifold, and we aren't always sure what they are or what people are using. So that's a job in itself to determine. Now, Danny mentioned the MAA with DPR, and we believe that DPR is making huge strides in this area and coordinating much better with the water boards. And so we think that would be the avenue for determining which alternatives we need to look for. And if we know that, then we're happy to do it. So what we want is simply direction on which alternatives we should be monitoring for. And so there is a statement further on in the last paragraph right now that says, in developing the monitoring and reporting programs for specific discharges, the board will, in conjunction with DPR, assist the discharger in identifying diazepam and chlorpyrifos alternatives for which monitoring may be necessary. We'd like to just see that inserted in number 3, at the beginning of number 3, and then I would say discharges will then determine whether those identified alternatives to diazepam and chlorpyrifos are being discharged at concentrations with the potential to cause.
Or that paragraph might be referenced there at this point.
I think it I do like these circumstances when we're at least close enough that what we're really arguing about is moving a sentence from a paragraph that applies to 2 provisions into the provisions itself. I think, we actually have a little bit of a change. I think that Tess recommended to that last paragraph that you referenced that, further strengthens the board's commitment to working with DPR. And I do think it's important to leave this particular provision relatively open-ended with the concept in mind that this is the basin plan amendment, so it lays out, the blueprint for how the board is going to work through its permits, and we want that blueprint to be relatively broad and hash out the details about the reasonableness of the monitoring requirements in the individual permitting actions themselves, and so that we can really tailor them to areas, suppose we got a municipality with 10 golf courses next to their MS4 system. I think that might be a little different than a municipality with 0 diazepam chlorpyrifos sources that we can easily see. So to the extent that we can hash out those details in the permitting actions, I'd prefer to do that there. I'd recommend to do that there as opposed to in the basin plan itself. And again, I would recommend letting Tess speak as well, because I know she has some language she's suggesting here that I think we're on the same page with, and see if that allays your concerns. But we're certainly committed to working with DPR because they've got the library and the expertise to really do these things, and our staff really interprets what they say and uses their expertise specific to water quality issues. So DPR is a vital link in that chain.
And we just want the assurance that will continue and that the alternatives will be identified, so we're not constantly searching the universe for additional forms of life.
Right. Mr. Ruby, does that conclude your comment?
Yeah, just one quick, and we just also appreciate the board's recognition in the concluding paragraph of the amendment that regional or other representative monitoring programs can be used to meet the monitoring goals. And just want to reiterate that DPR has embarked on a statewide monitoring program now, which we think would be a suitable representative replacement for local monitoring for pesticides impacts.
Thank you, sir, for your comments.
Thank you very much.
Next speaker.
Carl, on process, I find it extremely difficult to think about modifying language when I see nothing and I'm just seeing it. And I can understand taking out a section that our legal counsel recommends we do, but partly this is just for our public speakers, is when you have things like that, bring some written copies so we can look at what we're talking about. Because
made some copies for you.
I don't have them.
Well, let's have
This
Tess speak.
is specific for Tess's, but it goes to this. This is the provisions that we're talking about. So.
Tess?
Actually, you know what? Debbie's going to give those because I did those this morning for Civic because I'm speaking on other stuff for ag later.
So many hats, Tess.
Debbie's going to do these.
Tess, I understand you've confused us completely.
I know, too many clients, too many hats.
Do you get to bill them both at the same time because you're here representing them both?
Violation of rule of ethics, Bob, and I would never do that.
I'm Debbie Webster with the Central Valley Clean Water Association, and I appreciate the time to talk. And just so you know, yes, the edits that she gave are our behalf on us because we represent the POTWs in the Central Valley. She's going to speak on ag, which are different. So she's going to talk to a different location. To give a little bit of background, just setting this part up is that as was outlined to you, POTWs really are almost non-sources. It shows up every once in a while as reasonable potential, but there's a cost to us from this Basin Plan Amendment. And cost for doing pesticide monitoring is not insignificant. And so it's something that we're concerned with. We really appreciate many of the changes made to reduce the impact of this Basin Plan Amendment to POTWs. But we also really think that the Basin Plan Amendments need to be right because they don't get changed often. And even when everybody around the table says, yeah, this is reasonable, and yeah, you do this, and if it's in the Basin Plan, there's no movement. And so, yes, we're giving you some stuff, and we've got some written things that, but I wanted to give you that in setting up. So two of our concerns first is that we want to make sure that things that we don't need to continue don't continue. And as I think Patrick alluded to, and you can see in there, the comments on alternatives and what alternative pesticides, it didn't get that same provision that it could be discontinued if there was no reasonable potential. And so our suggested language also includes that. But there's a second nuance that may not be so obvious in that, and that is that when we monitor for effluent, it requires some specific monitoring methods. We have a complex effluent. There's different things in there. And so what we might be able to monitor, a method that we might be able to use for a stream or you might use for drinking water doesn't work for wastewater. And so we need methods that are reliable. Otherwise you get interference and you don't know if the result is correct or not. And so in our nuance on this alternative, it's very important for us to have methods that work. And so with our language, and I'll go through that in just a second, we're picking up that nuance in that we really want, when those alternatives are chosen, we want to make sure that they work for POTWs and that we're not trying to chase something that we're going to get something that we don't know if it's reliable. So just know that. So the two changes are the change that we'd really like to see. And by the way, I know that you have the page C9 and C10 on your resolution. This is the same thing, but it's on page 7 of the resolution. So I'm going to go off of that. What we'd really like to see is point 3 removed, and just not to address that, and thinking that it still can be addressed by your executive officer. And sorry, Carl, I need to take a little bit longer.
When you say 3, you're talking about paragraph number 3 under municipal stormwater, municipal and domestic wastewater monitoring?
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
So we think that those alternatives can be taken care of once things are addressed through 13267 or other ways. It doesn't need to be in the Basin Plan. Alternatively, we would suggest that that paragraph be removed, and then that last sentence in that final paragraph in that section that you see on there, in that section, be removed and replaced with the following language.
You say final paragraph. You're talking about
the one that starts with the executive officer approval.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so we would strike that last sentence, and we'd say, with respect to alternatives to diazon and or chlorpyrifos, the executive officer should consider if monitoring for alternatives is necessary to include in monitoring and reporting programs for any discharges to tabled 3-2A. In determining if such monitoring is necessary and to identify the alternative for which monitoring might be appropriate, the board will consult and coordinate with CDPR, or the pesticide regulation, California Department of Pesticide Regulation. And by the reason why that nuance is, we think it's important down in this section rather than above, is for that whole issue of whether or not there is a reliable method. If it's above, it's kind of like it's there, you're stuck with it, and you're not sure if it's going to be there. If it's below, this really puts it in that.
Debbie, you have a piece of paper to give us?
You
hand up?
actually have it, I think. Do you? He has it.
This is actually slightly different.
Oh, slightly different.
The version that we had, it strikes the last sentence and then says, in determining if monitoring for alternatives to diazinon and/or chlorpyrifos is necessary, and to identify alternatives for which monitoring might be appropriate, the board will consult and coordinate with DPR.
Yeah.
The original email says delete number 3. I think that is still up for debate. I think we very much want our diazinon and chlorpyrifos program to still take a look at alternatives out there and leave that to the NPDES permitting to determine.
And I think our suggestion still allows for that. What it does is it takes care of that nuance of, it's very similar to this language, but it takes care of that nuance about monitoring. And just a very, very, very small technical part is in that second sentence that starts in that last paragraph of with the executive officer approval, that very last phrase when it says may be used to meet the monitoring goals, instead of saying listed above, just leave it there. Because as we talk about what monitoring and how we do it with these alternatives, we wouldn't want that limited only to alternatives. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So we have something handed out to us which I understand is slightly different than what you said.
Yeah, maybe I can help. So there we go. Okay, so and I appreciate staff's effort, and I will say that, so staff went and prepared this somewhat in part based upon some language that I had emailed to Danny and Patrick this morning. So I did not actually have a handout to provide because I didn't have a printer available this morning, but I did provide it to staff this morning at the beginning of the meeting. So what our suggestion is, and this is kind of staff taking into consideration, I believe, our suggestion, so it is slightly different. What we had originally proposed is that you delete the number 3, which is of that monitoring provision.
We understand that.
Okay, and then you would add at the very bottom a whole new paragraph to the monitoring, which would be the paragraph that Debbie read. So instead of having number 3, you'd have this monitoring paragraph that with respect to alternatives, or it could replace number 3. I mean, I don't think it matters which way you do it. You could do it as a replacement to number 3 or as a standalone paragraph on its own.
But the wording that we have, how does that differ from what you're asking for?
Okay, so the wording that, and let's see, I was just handed this, is similar, but the difference is what this is proposing, instead of deleting number 3, see the red up above where it says regular monitoring for diazinon and chlorpyrifos and alternatives can be discontinued upon showing? What ours says instead is that the executive officer should consider whether alternative monitoring should be included at the time you issue the WDR or the permit. We're basically reiterating existing authority of the executive officer. This is different in that the Basin Plan Amendment would mandate it, but the EO could discontinue it based upon showings. So there is a fair difference between the two.
I think, and I think that raises another concern in terms of whether the EO can herself revise monitoring and reporting programs for NPDES permits. And I think that is a much more difficult question. And to be frank, we talk about making modifications here. The provision that EPA commented on this Basin Plan Amendment and saying that this is a workable model for exception to the TMDL. I would be hesitant to pull out this particular provision because EPA is certainly very concerned both with alternatives and with the fact that we have provisions specific to alternatives in this program. Again, I can't speak for them because they're not here, but I think that pulling out that provision could seriously jeopardize our ability to go in front of them and say, hey, we've effectively dealt with this and get this off the 303D list.
When you say pulling out this provision, are you talking about deleting 3 and/or giving the EO the authority to?
Both. I think they would object to giving the EO authority to modify NPDES monitoring requirements. That's something that's generally only done by the board,
I think that's a point well taken, and that could easily be changed to the board
on a
versus
minute.
the
Hang
executive
on.
officer. I don't,
Carl,
I think
excuse
that's a
me,
point
Tess,
well
just a
taken.
second.
Yes, Bob?
On process issues here, like, I'm getting a little bit confused, and I'd like some clarity in a process here where we can get to an answer. Can we hold this item, and you guys maybe, after we go through the rest of it, Mike can discuss it and see if you have any agreement? Right now, I am not inclined whatsoever to take 3 out of this document. I might be inclined to make some adjustments for clarity to the following paragraph, but without a lot more discussion, I'm not going to meddle in the middle of this that has huge ramifications.
I think Bob makes a good point. We could go on to the next item, give you an hour or so to come to some sort of conclusion, come back to us with language. I would have to concur with what Patrick was saying, is that EPA looked at a particular document. I believe that EPA would have reservations, those reservations that Patrick mentioned. And I think I would hope that the parties, as they go through preparing a document we could read, would keep that in mind.
Can I make one comment with?
Excuse me, Tess, I just want to also say is I do appreciate the efforts to address your concerns at this board meeting. I think, getting this right is important, and hearing your concerns and us really trying to address them, I appreciate that. So I'm not trying to short circuit that process, but I'm trying to get some process that'll get us to a
Well,
resolution.
and I appreciate that, and I just want to make one quick note on the issue of number 3 is very consistent with comments that Civiqua and stormwater people have made. This is not our concern with the number 3 is not something we've just thrown out here today. So I am a little, if the answer is always, well, we can't change that now because EPA has seen this version, then why does the board ever have a consideration of anything? Because this is our chance to finally talk to you about that concern. So just, I am a little bit bothered somewhat by, well, EPA approved this version, that if that's the case, then you've just taken all the discretion away from the board.
Pamela?
Well noted, Tess, but I don't think that's what's happening here, but I don't think number 3 should be removed, but I think we've handled this through the rice order you adopted yesterday, dealing with degradates, not alternatives. And we've had some footnotes in there which we could probably incorporate where, it's based on having commercially available analytical methods that are proven, and also in consultation with DPR and what those can be. But it's in consultation, but I would be hesitant to recommend that the board remove an item from the basin plan where they have to evaluate for alternatives. But we can establish a process by which those alternatives are selected. And that would be incorporated into monitoring plans that we present to the board for approval, but I don't have the authority to change.
So you're talking about changing some language here to...
Changing the following paragraph, and I think we can work on that as Member Schneider recommends.
Okay, what I suggest is that I'm going to go through the other interested parties here. They may have something that is just earth-shattering, will change our mind altogether. I'm not being facetious. That does happen, and for us to not hear them before we go on to the next item, I think would be remiss. Dellen Ellison Lloyd, or Daylin, I guess, Ellison Lloyd.
Well, I hope what I have to say is earth-shattering for you.
I'm sorry?
I hope what I have to say is earth-shattering for you.
Okay.
Yes. My name is Dylan Ellison Lloyd. I'm a senior engineer with the City of Roseville, and we are a Phase 2 MS4. And although we are subject to the monitoring requirements under our NPDES permit, we are no longer subject to the TMDL monitoring requirements that would have been pertinent to this particular diazinon and chlorpyrifos substances. But I wanted to say that the City of Roseville is concerned with the base and pen language, and we're here today to support, to express our support for the comments made by the Stormwater Quality Partnership. And of course, the most problematic portions of the BPA presented today surround the municipal monitoring program that stormwater discharges are required to adhere to. And specifically, you've heard those, number 2 and number 3, to determine whether discharges cause or contribute to toxicity impairment due to additivity or synergistic effects of multiple pollutants, and to determine whether alternatives to diazinon and chlorpyrifos are being discharged at concentrations with the potential to cause or to contribute to exceedance of water quality objectives. As previously stated by others, these provisions are overly broad and will tax the capabilities and capacities of municipal stormwater dischargers. We're not usually too acquainted with the variety of pesticides that are made available to the public at large. And as we've described in our written comments to the board on this subject, investigations to the causes of water quality impairments due to additivity or synergistic effects of pollutants falls into the realm of research, and toxicity bioassays only provide a measure of the aggregate toxic effect of a sample, and this measurement in no way evaluates the possibility of interactions of multiple pollutants. Without significant and substantial follow-up effort, it is not possible to determine if the observed toxicity is caused by one or more toxicants, let alone whether those toxicants interact in an additive, synergistic, or even antagonistic way. We agree with the proposal from the Sacramento Stormwater Quality Partnership that determining whether toxicity impairment is caused by additive or synergistic effects should fall upon the regional board and its counterparts in Department of Pesticide Regulation, also at EPA and at the University of California. And I'll kind of diverge from my notes right now in just saying that, additional pesticides are emerging, the pyrethroids, the neonicotinoids, and probably the things that will replace them. However, with this being so broad, we're set out to monitor for a wide universe of pollutants that we as MS4s don't know what those pollutants are. And we're looking for the regional board, with collaboration through Department of Pesticide Regulation, to tell us what to monitor for. Oh goodness, that went fast. To tell us what we need to monitor for, whether it's the pyrethroids, whether it's the neonicotinoids, and whatever their replacement may be. Let us know what those are, so that we can provide the information that you need. So with that,
Thank you
I
very
guess I'm
much.
done.
Are there any questions? Thank you for your testimony.
You're welcome.
I have a card, actually 2 cards from Mr. Daggett. Oh, I'm sorry. Miss Daggett. I couldn't read, I'm sorry, I couldn't read the first name. The first name is? Maureen. Okay, I'm sorry. If I
Now,
could,
I'm presenting comments on behalf of Kathy Kinsland of Argonaut Consulting. She's in Michigan. And I have a set of comments, and the young men outside said give it to somebody in here. So I'm not sure who I'm supposed to give these to.
Were these comments submitted already?
No.
We can't accept them. I mean, the board ordinarily
the
doesn't
chair has
accept
to
these.
rule
into
on
the-
that, but there is a timeline for submitting those. You can read them into the record.
Okay. I will do that as best I can. The concerns that Argonaut has is regarding the SID, and specifically,
And when you read those, be careful. I'll give you a couple of minutes extra, but you're on very limited amount of time, and so you need to hit the highlights.
Yep, that's what, they're yellowed.
Thank you.
The concern is with the SID, and particularly its adherence with CEQA. Oh, good God. CEQA defines a project as an activity which may cause either a direct physical or a reasonably foreseeable indirect physical change in the environment beyond cumulative effects. If you follow staff's logic, the management practices that dischargers may use are practices which staff already acknowledges are currently routinely incorporated in most discharges' daily operations. These same current practices are the sources of the significant potential impacts identified in the SID. In fact, staff is attempting to conduct an environmental impact analysis on potential activities already being done lawfully by dischargers, and that does not necessarily result in any new direct or indirect physical alteration of the environment. My allergy pill just stopped. CEQA cannot be applied retroactively to project activities that are already allowed by law or by permit. Regional board staff cannot compel mitigation for impacts that have already occurred in the environment, since by definition there is no change to the environment. There also was not a no alternative or no action alternative done in compliance with CEQA, and there certainly was no project, no action alternative addressing the municipal and industrial dischargers. There was some language that talked about the ag discharges, but there certainly was no language or discussion about municipal or industrial. And that is a mandatory requirement of CEQA, is the no project alternative. The mitigation imposed by the SID is speculative, and it applies to impacts which staff have already admitted are not significant. The mitigation as designed addresses impacts which may have already occurred and creates a retroactive regulatory tripwire for discharges that are currently not required by law to engage in it. Specifically, she refers to the biological impacts, which impose mitigation for the speculative impacts associated with runoff reduction and those impacts to wetlands. Yet in the statement of overriding conditions, staff says that the proposed amendment will only potentially affect substandard habitat. So it can't be significant and be substandard.
There were a number of points made in the testimony just given. Does and staff provide a reply?
Absolutely. First of all, I think what we're talking about here is something different than a typical environmental impact report. Obviously, it's a supplemental environmental document that requires us to run through the checklist to determine whether there are significant impacts and to inform the board what the impacts might be. Certainly, there was a no action alternative included in there. I mean, we follow the regulatory provisions pertinent to our specific regulatory program and our governing regulations. With respect to any potential significant effect, what we've done in the checklist is really outlined for the board that, yes, increased focus on diazinon chlorpyrifos might result in a few more buffer strips being installed, might result in, say, folks changing their irrigation practices. So there may be some isolated wetlands that were created by leaky pipes that dry up. There might be some habitat that was created by, buffer zones that might be changed. So we report that back to the board and say, look, there are some substandard habitats that may be changed into buffer strips or deprived of water by fixing leaky pipes, and that's a potentially significant outcome of this basin plan amendment, because we're talking about implementing this across the entire Central Valley. So that was what the analysis concluded, and I really would take issue. I think we did our CEQA analysis very well for this project.
And I'm not the wetlands biologist, but her objection is that she disagrees with the gentleman at the end of the table. She is a CEQA specialist and a wetlands biologist. Unfortunately, she's not here, so that's all I can say in her defense.
We thank you for your comments.
Okay. Now, do I sit down and stand up again?
Well, one card is, you really can't submit two cards, but go ahead, and if you can very quickly give us your other comments on your behalf.
On my behalf, what I've concerned about is in the SID, there was no discussion why the US EPA criteria for these two pesticides, which are magnitudes higher than what's being proposed by this amendment, why those criteria are not effective in protecting the beneficial uses that are being proposed in this amendment. There's no discussion why those aren't sufficient. US EPA guidance on water quality criteria and objectives state that you select the highest concentration that will protect the beneficial use, but don't. So the question is, why are the national recommended criteria not effective? Secondly, I am concerned, my area of expertise is industrial compliance, stormwater specifically, and I'm concerned about the language that implies that constructed water bodies, constructed conveyances, and ag drains are waters of the state. If the existence of a beneficial use in a constructed water body defines it as water of the state, then my parents' backyard pool is waters of the state. Based on that approach, that definition, MS4s, their conveyances are waters of the state as opposed to point source discharges. And that's it.
Patrick?
Well, I think that we've got a couple things going on here. First of all, the supplemental environmental document isn't just the checklist, it's the staff report as well. And the staff report does have a discussion on why the particular methodology was used. I mean, it has a very extensive discussion of that. And that's part of the supplemental environmental documents. The other component that you talked about was that the EPA regs somehow require us to pick the highest constituent concentration that we can find. That's just not a correct statement of law. It also ignores the anti-degradation provisions in both the federal and state law that we have to comply with. Lastly, you talked about waters of the state. I'm not sure. I think you're trying to talk about waters of the U.S. and
no. Applying my understanding is that these water quality objectives are intended to be applied to constructed water bodies.
Absolutely.
Okay. The concern is, what defines a constructed water body? And when did a constructed water body or a constructed conveyance become waters of the state as opposed to a point source?
The distinction actually isn't between waters of the state and point sources. Again, I think there's a bit of a use of confusing terms here. Waters of the state is a very broad term. It includes the water in ag drains, it includes isolated wetlands, it includes groundwater. And then I think what you're talking about with respect to point sources are discharges into federal jurisdictional waterways, navigable waterways under the Clean Water Act. Again, the state certainly has the authority to impose water quality objectives on waters of the state, which do include ag drains.
I guess then at what point? Because almost all farming operations will have their constructed drainage to move water from one parcel to the next. Are those waters of the state where water quality criteria has to be met, or are they point sources?
Carl, I don't think this is the time or place to have this back and forth discussion.
Just to, cap this off, I think, the state has pretty broad authority over a lot of these sources. A lot of these arguments have been made and resolved. And I think for the purposes of this discussion, yes, we do have the ability to regulate those ag drains. And the board is actually engaged in a fairly comprehensive process to determine what type of aquatic beneficial uses, municipal uses, and agricultural supply uses apply to those ag drains. And I think it's going through a very thorough evaluation. But what we're really dealing with here is a water quality objective related to aquatic life in those areas that we protect that aquatic life.
Well, thank you.
This could be a conversation that goes on for a long time. If you have confusion on this and also on the SEP as being an environmental document, my experience is exactly what Mr. Plupa has outlined. In fact, the total document comprises an environmental document and, of course, is recognized as such by EPA. The SEP is the supplemental environmental information that's provided. But I would suggest that you contact Mr. Palupa or one of our other attorneys, and they can provide you that kind of information that I think would help clarify your points.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. And somebody here could give you their contact information.
I think I have that gentleman's.
Oh, you're on the fast dial, Patrick. I have one card left. Tess Dunham. She's already used up 2.5 of her 3 minutes.
That was the wrong client. Tess Dunham here today for, at this point, for the East San Joaquin Water Quality Coalition, and I want to make a couple of comments with respect to some of the agricultural provisions within the Basin Plan Amendment. First, I do want to thank staff. There have been a number of changes in response to our comments, and I do appreciate those. I do think that they help provide some clarity to the Basin Plan Amendment and some more consistency with the long-term irrigated lands program, and they are greatly appreciated. Along those lines, to further that connection between the irrigated lands and the Basin Plan Amendment, with respect to the late revisions and the addition of the new finding number 39, and I apologize, Board Member Schneider, I don't have this typed out, and not to be critical of staff, but because we just got the late revisions this morning, but that's just how it works sometimes, and we understand that. So what I have suggested, I have given some handwritten language over to Patrick, that where we have discussion with respect to management plans, we also include monitoring. So basically this finding would talk about consistency with the monitoring provisions and the management plans with respect to the irrigated lands program. So I've proposed that revision. I also do want to make one comment, and it's not carrying over the conversation that just happened previously, but it is a somewhat nuance in that, and actually I'd planned to say this long before the last speaker. I do think that we have a little bit of confusion in some of the comments on the staff PowerPoint presentation and in the staff report. You know, one of the slides early on in the staff presentation made the comment that there was flexibility with respect to the application of the beneficial uses to constructed facilities in light of the fact that, you know, there is some longstanding memorandums and policies within the board policy that through the tributary rule arguably is not applicable to apply beneficial uses to constructed facilities, and I agree with that. But then we also have some statements later on, and slide 40 in particular, and a statement on the staff report that the comment is made that we have existing uses in these water bodies and in constructed facilities, which to me is saying we know we have existing warm and beneficial aquatic life uses. But so I think that there's some inconsistency there. And because we are talking about a long-term process of looking about what are the appropriate beneficial uses for some of these, having comments and staff reports that basically say we have existing uses, which is a loaded term under use attainability vernacular and under the Clean Water Act, I'm a little concerned that we've created some confusion.
Go ahead, Patrick.
All right. I actually do like this stuff. In terms of what's happening in those ag drains, it may be that the staff report did, and I do agree with you that we should pay a little closer attention to the use of existing uses there. For the board's benefit, what we're doing here is saying that for any waterway with a warm or cold beneficial use, this is the water quality objective that will apply. That's fairly straightforward. The devil in the details comes into whether a set of ag drains has that warm or cold beneficial use. And that's the process that's underway. I think CV Salts is involved with that. But, and to go back to what the slide says, I believe the slide was trying to convey that there is aquatic life using those ag drains, and there's certainly aquatic life in those ag drains. One of the tasks that the Basin Plan Amendment process, not this one, but the others, is trying to do is figure out what's needed to protect that aquatic life in those ag drains. What types of uses are we trying to protect there? I think it's an easier question with respect to diazinon chlorpyrifos, because generally speaking, we're talking about very low on the food chain. These diazinon chlorpyrifos impacts would be felt on that very low level. But Tess is correct. We're not saying in this basin plan amendment that the warm and cold beneficial uses automatically apply to every single ag drain in the state. We're just saying that where they do apply, question somewhat unanswered, this is going to be the number that we're going to use to protect it, and this is the process that we're going to use to protect it.
And I agree with Patrick, and I appreciate that clarification. I just want to make sure for the record that we have that clarification on the board, so some statements and staff reports don't come back to haunt us at a later date when we're trying to perhaps create some tiered aquatic life uses.
Thank you very much, Tess.
Oh, and then of course there's, Patrick, I don't know, the revisions that I had proposed to the finding.
Well, I think we're going to have to talk about process right here now. If we are going to go on to the next item and let you guys work things out, I would propose that you also address those at that time.
I think that's the direction we're going in, and thankfully we're trying to hit the same target here, so we're on the same page as far as that's concerned. I will note that I'm at least waist deep in the next item too, so I'll have to be here for that. Can't leave the room for that item. But just to encapsulate what we're trying to do here, what the goals are, what I've heard from the board is that it's probably okay to eliminate number 2 on page C9. Number 3, I think it's an open question. My recommendation is to keep number 3 in there. And then with respect to the paragraph below that, I think we're open to tinkering with that a bit to try and make it clear that we're not talking about monitoring for diazinon chlorpyrifos and alternatives in perpetuity where that need doesn't exist, and to certainly coordinate with DPR and coming up with a suite of alternatives that we want to be monitoring for. There's also the issue of revising that new finding 39 that we recently proposed after talking with Joe's unit quite extensively. We intend to make this basin plan amendment, or the basin plan amendment it was developed in conjunction with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, so they're both supposed to be consistent. The recommendation from Tess is to add monitoring into the management plan provisions, essentially the statement that that's consistent too. I think that's fine to do. It's fine to hash out that language. I don't have the exact language lined up in front of me.
It's kind of wishy-squishy right now, so we're going to have written language. Is there somebody else who could, in lieu of your presence, work with the dischargers to be able to
I think Danny's got it.
He's got it. Okay, good. If we're going to then continue this item.
And can I just jump in and say
Yes.
that I think that, at least I feel strongly that paragraph 3 stays in.
I do too, and Bob's expressed that, so I think Jenny has weighed in on it too.
And
So
I want to, my concerns here are just a little bit about process, but a key element for me in process is making sure that the public's heard and their concerns get addressed. So I'm not trying to sidestep that. And this comment about the test made, I think, about, EPA says it, so you're not going to change it. I mean, this board has to make its decisions based on what it thinks is the best policy.
Exactly.
And if we ultimately have to go back to EPA, we go back to EPA. But, so I'm trying to balance a little bit about, I'm trying to hear this clearly, and without a little more process, it makes it very difficult for me to hear this and make a good decision. So this is my best effort to respond to the comments.
They have an hour to get back to us, and because hopefully we could do the next item within an hour. We'll see if we can. So this item is continued. I am moving to item 28. Amendment to the basin plan regarding Royal Mountain King Mine, Calaveras County. This is the time and place for a hearing to consider amendment of the Sacramento and San Joaquin Rivers Basin Plan to provide a groundwater regulatory framework towards closure of the Royal Mountain King Mine site in Calaveras County. Is there anyone present who is contesting the proposed actions and wishes to present evidence or testimony on this matter? Hello. Okay. Since there are persons present wishing to contest this item, we will proceed with the hearing. This hearing will be conducted in accordance with the notice of public hearing and the meeting procedures published with the meeting agenda. At this time, evidence should be introduced on whether the proposed action should be taken. Following the staff presentation, Mr. Victor Iso and Meridian Beartrack may each speak for 10 minutes, and then other interested parties may speak for 3 minutes each. A timer will be used. We'll begin with staff testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Before we get going,
Good-
any legal issues at this point?
Not at this point.
Great, go ahead.
I said good morning, but it is in fact afternoon.
Yes.
Ken Landau, Assistant Executive Officer with the Board, Rancho Cordova office. Just a historic note, this is the first time I remember us ever having 5 basin planning items on the same board agenda. So, this item is a basin plan amendment to remove or modify beneficial uses in the groundwater at the Royal Mountain King Mine site in Calaveras County. Although not common, this board has removed or modified beneficial uses at a number of locations in ground and surface waters when studies have shown that the beneficial uses had not existed, were not attainable, or that attainment was unreasonably expensive. In this case, mining operations were conducted at a naturally mineralized area, Salt Spring Valley. Mining operations often occur in areas with salty groundwater because the very minerals that are being mined cause the groundwater to be salty. Groundwater quality at the area is highly variable, with pockets of fresh groundwater intermixed with salty groundwater. If this mining operation was proposed today, we would require liners and caps for the waste rock landfills because salt leaches from the crushed rock in the landfills. However, the potential for salt leaching from the waste rock was not recognized at the time of permitting, and the mining operation has contributed to the salinity of the groundwater. It is not feasible, after the mining has been completed, to go back and move over 50 million tons of waste rock into new lined landfills. In order to reduce the impacts of mining waste to groundwater, this board adopted waste discharge requirements in 2001 and 2003, requiring that the discharger place caps on the waste rock landfills to limit rainfall infiltration through the rock, carrying the salt into the groundwater. Those orders were petitioned to the state board, and the state board issued a decision that rejected capping of the waste piles as ineffective without a liner. And further, the state board stated that installation of a liner and cap was too expensive. The state board required the regional board to consider a number of other options, one of which was de-designation of the groundwater. The proposed basin plan amendment would either de-designate groundwater uses or provide variances to those uses that are impacted by salt and arsenic. Again, some of the area is naturally salty, and those uses have never existed in those areas. Other areas of the groundwater have been impacted by mining activities, but at this time it is difficult to discern natural versus mining activities with any certainty. The proposed amendment is one of 3 board actions which collectively minimize further degradation and will keep the salty groundwater from moving down gradient and impacting other groundwaters. First, this basin plan amendment keeps the mine owner from having to conduct remedial work that has no realistic chance of restoring beneficial uses. The mine owner had originally wanted a much broader de-designation that would have allowed them to walk away from the site. This proposed amendment does not allow that. The geographic scope of the de-designation is much smaller than originally proposed, and the mine owner will have a continuing responsibility for water and waste management at the site. The second action is that this board has already adopted waste discharge requirements for closure maintenance at the site. That order will be updated to implement the groundwater management required to comply with this basin plan amendment. And third, this board has adopted an NPDES permit for the discharge of collected groundwater into an adjacent creek at times when there is assimilative capacity in that creek and the beneficial uses of the surface waters are protected. There is basically too much water in the mine area, and the NPDES discharge is needed to maintain control of the groundwater and assure that the salty groundwater does not move away from the site. Staff has been working on this for many years, and the proposal will protect groundwater and is feasible to implement. And with that brief overview, I'll turn this over to Sue McConnell to provide a more detailed presentation on the Basin Plan Amendment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Longley, members of the board. I'm Sue McConnell, Chief of the Planning and Assessment Unit here in the Rancho Cordova office. With me is Gene Davis, an engineering geologist, and we're here to present a proposed amendment for the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Basin Plan. This amendment is unique in that it was developed in response to a state board remand order, and it includes a proposal to amend the sources of drinking water policy. It's a groundwater regulatory framework for the Royal Mountain King mine to move that site towards closure. Mining at the site ended 20 years ago, and staff has been working with the responsible parties to close the site ever since. It's a large site with a complicated regulatory history. Open pit gold mining activities conducted at this site in compliance with waste discharge requirements resulted in groundwater impairment, and cleanup now, decades after the mining activities, would be extremely difficult and very expensive. So the amendment includes a groundwater management strategy, as well as de-designation and variances for groundwater beneficial uses. This planning effort was partially funded by Meridian Bear Track, who is responsible for closure of the site. This is just an outline of the presentation. I'll start with describing the physical setting of the Royal Mountain King, or RMK, mine site, the site geology, groundwater characteristics, and mining features. Then move into the extensive regulatory history of the site, which led to the development of this Basin Plan Amendment. I will discuss how we solicited public input and scientific review for this effort and explain the elements of the Basin Plan. After that, I will cover the comments we received and our response to comments and a minor late revision. Finally, I will provide staff's recommendation. The Royal Mountain King mine is about 40 miles east of Stockton, and 2 to 3 miles northwest of Copperopolis in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. It's also within the Salt Spring Valley in Calaveras County. This map, produced by the Calaveras County Water District, identifies the salt springs within the Salt Spring Valley in the Copperopolis area. And staff added a purple rectangle to the map to show the location of the site, as well as the fact that natural salt springs occurs at the site. This picture, also from the Calaveras County Water District, shows salt deposits from low-flow springs in the Salt Spring Valley. So they're the white deposits in the photograph. This geologic map shows the faults and the rock types at the Royal Mountain King mine site. There's the Little John's Fault on the western portion of the site, and the Hudson Fault towards the west. In general, east of the Little John's Fault, groundwater is in greenstone and tends to be better quality. West of the Hudson Fault, groundwater is in phyllite and tends to be of poorer quality. Phyllite is derived from deep ocean deposits and has natural salt contents, relatively high natural salt contents. And between the two faults, groundwater is in a mixture of greenstone and phyllite, and the quality is variable. So this is a very general description of the groundwater quality. A number of wells and piezometers have been installed at the site, and groundwater quality will be discussed again later in the presentation. This is just a picture of the RMK mine site looking northwest. I'll come back to this picture after the mining features are discussed. This is a footprint of the RMK mine site. It is, like Ken says, a very large site with an area of about 2,100 acres or 3.3 square miles. This site was mined for about 5 years, from 1989 to 1994, with 3 open pits: the North Pit, the Skyrocket Pit, and the Gold No Pit. From these pits, about 56 million tons of ore and waste rock were removed. The Gold No Pit was later backfilled with mining overburden, forming an overburden disposal site, or ODS. Overburden, or waste rock, is the material that has to be moved to get to the ore with the gold. 2 other overburden disposal sites were also created, the West ODS and the Flotation Tailings Reservoir, or FTR ODS. Together, there's about 50 million tons of materials in these disposal sites, covering about 200 acres. Initial waste discharge requirements for the site classify the overburden as inert mining waste. So the disposal sites were built without liners or covers or engineered containment features. Waste classification and its implications are an important component of this amendment and will be covered in greater detail during the discussion of the site's regulatory history. After mining, the North and Skyrocket pits filled with groundwater inflow to become pit lakes. So in addition to the 3 ODSs and Skyrocket Pit Lake, there is one other waste management unit at the site that has not been closed, the Flotation Tailings Reservoir, or FTR, located at the northern end of the site. What this amendment addresses is the level of protection that should be afforded the groundwater beneath and immediately down gradient of these 5 waste management units. So here's that same picture you saw earlier. Skyrocket Pit Lake is in the middle of the picture. On the upper northeast corner is the Flotation Tailings Reservoir, or FTR. Immediately south of that is the FTR Overburden Disposal Site. The West Overburden Disposal Site is on the western edge of the picture, and the Gold No ODS is south and outside of the picture. So I also want to point out the Skyrocket Pit Lake Dam, located at the southwestern end of the lake. There's an MPDS permitted discharge of the Pit Lake water taken from this dam, and that'll be discussed later as well. And the overall closure strategy for the site is dependent on getting the saline leachate from the waste management units, collecting that and taking that to the Pit Lake, and then having this MPDS permitted discharge from the lake. Okay, the regulatory history. Our board adopted waste discharge requirements for RMK mine in 1988, the year before mining activities began. In these waste discharge requirements, overburden was classified as inert mining waste. Mining activities ended in 1994, and Meridian began the process of closing the site. In 2001 and 2003, the board adopted new orders for the site based on reclassification of that overburden. Those orders imposed much more stringent closure requirements. Like Ken says, it included covers for the overburden disposal sites. Those orders were petitioned to the State Board, and in 2004, the State Water Board issued a remand order, which will be discussed in a later slide. But the remand order led to an MPDS permit to allow surface water discharges from Skyrocket Pit Lake. That permit was originally adopted in 2007 and then updated last year. The remand order also led to new closure WDRs for the site, which left open the issue of long-term groundwater protection at the site. And finally, that remand order led to the contract with Meridian to partially fund development of this proposed amendment. Title 27 contains the state's waste management regulations and includes criteria for classifying mining waste. Group B mining wastes are defined to contain soluble pollutants in concentrations that could cause exceedances of water quality objectives, whereas Group C mining waste could not cause exceedances of any objective but turbidity. So Group B waste management units require liners, covers, or other containment features, whereas Group C units do not. In the 1988 waste discharge requirements for RMK mine, the board classified the overburden as inert or Group C waste because it was not acid generating, which, as you heard yesterday, is often a concern for mining operations. So the overburden disposal sites were built to Group C standards. In 2001 and 2003, our board adopted orders that reclassify the overburden to Group B mining waste, mostly because of elevated salts, that's total dissolved solids, or TDS, sulfates, nitrates, and also because of some elevated arsenic levels. In 2004, the State Board issued a remand order which recognized that the RMK mine had negatively impacted groundwater in some areas, but that groundwater at the site is highly variable and can be poor under natural circumstances. The State Board found that compliance with Group B closure standards would be extremely costly and would likely provide limited water quality benefits. Installing liners and covers for the overburden disposal sites was estimated to cost $130 million. Given the groundwater conditions at the site and the cost of compliance, the remand order directed our board to find an alternative and more reasonable approach to closure. The State Water Board directed us to consider the establishment of a groundwater containment zone and beneficial use dedesignation as potential elements of that alternative approach. The remand order led to this basin plan amendment to evaluate the groundwater beneficial uses at the site. And instead of a formal containment zone, the amendment includes provisions to ensure that impacts to groundwater do not spread beyond the dedesignation area. Before discussing the elements of the basin plan amendment, I will explain how public input and scientific review shaped the amendment and also briefly cover the sources of drinking water policy. In 2011, we held 2 public meetings to discuss alternatives for the basin plan amendment. The first meeting in Stockton had very limited attendance, so we held another public scoping meeting in Copperopolis on a Saturday morning. Calaveras County staff and neighbors of RMK Mine attended the second meeting and generally supported the project. In 2012, the initial draft of the amendment and staff report was submitted for scientific peer review. The 2012 draft amendment included dedesignation of the municipal and domestic supply beneficial use based solely on the sources of drinking water exception criterion that allows dedesignation when the total dissolved solids is above 3,000 milligrams per liter. Several of the alternatives in the 2012 report relied on broad geological interpretations where poor quality groundwater occurs or could occur. A peer reviewer questioned the extent of the dedesignation area described in the recommended alternative. In response to the peer review comments, the staff report and basin plan amendment were revised to reduce the dedesignation area and include a policy rationale for the dedesignation. Staff met with State Board members to discuss a site-specific exception for RMK Mine to the sources of drinking water policy. State Board members we met with were generally supportive of this concept. In November 2013, the revised amendment and staff report were released for public review and comment, leading to today's hearing. Since this amendment includes the need for an exception to the sources of drinking water policy, I will briefly discuss the policy as it applies to groundwater. The policy states that all waters of the state are considered suitable or potentially suitable for municipal or domestic water supply, or MUN, with the exception of groundwater where the total dissolved solids exceed 3,000 milligrams per liter, or there's contamination that cannot reasonably be treated or for domestic use using best economically achievable treatment practices, or the water source does not provide an average sustained yield of 200 gallons per day. There can also be site-specific exceptions made to the sources of drinking water policy. An example is O Alamo Creek, a creek in our region which received a site-specific exception in 2006. We are working with the State Water Board to include a site-specific exception for groundwater for the RMK mine site. Okay, so finally, the Basin Plan Amendment. The proposed amendment contains 3 main elements. The first is a requirement to implement a groundwater management strategy to ensure existing groundwater impacts do not spread. That strategy also has 3 parts. The first is to maintain the lowest practicable water level in Skyrocket Pit Lake. The second is to prevent groundwater degradation down gradient of the dedesignation area. And the third is to pump saline leachate from the overburden disposal sites and the flotation tailings reservoir to Skyrocket Pit Lake. The groundwater management activities are part of the overall closure strategy for the site, which is to direct groundwater and saline leachate towards Skyrocket Pit Lake, and then manage the surface water discharges through an MPDS permit. The overall closure strategy will be implemented in 2 permits, the closure WDRs and the MPDS permit for the site. The second element of the Basin Plan Amendment is de-designation of the municipal and domestic supply, or MUN, and agricultural supply, or AGR, groundwater beneficial uses, where TDS levels exceed 3,000 milligrams per liter and beneath and immediately down gradient of the waste management units that have not been closed. The final element of this amendment is the establishment of variances for industrial service supply, or IND, and industrial process supply, or PRO, groundwater beneficial uses for TDS, arsenic, chloride, nitrate, selenium, and sulfate. With these variances, the board would continue to protect the industrial and processing beneficial uses for all constituents except those listed. The orange here area in this figure shows where groundwater has been measured to have TDS above 3,000 milligrams per liter. This area is based on current monitoring data, and we expect that the actual area with TDS over 3,000 milligrams per liter to be larger. For instance, pre-mining data showed that the groundwater beneath Skyrocket Pit Lake to have TDS over 3,000 milligrams per liter, and that area where the Skyrocket Pit Lake is now was identified as having natural salt springs. Also, as discussed earlier, the overburden disposal sites are not lined, and the leachate collected from those sites have TDS above 3,000. So it's likely groundwater underneath some of those sites also have TDS above 3,000 milligrams per liter. The red area in this figure is what's proposed for de-designation of municipal and agricultural groundwater beneficial uses and the variance of industrial and processing groundwater beneficial uses. So this area includes groundwater with TDS above 3,000 milligrams per liter, but also it includes groundwater beneath, all groundwater beneath and immediately down gradient of the waste management units. So the area was delineated to be consistent with the remand order to provide a reasonable groundwater regulatory framework to move the site towards closure. Delineation is also supported by the fact that groundwater in this area has not been and is not currently being used for municipal or agricultural purposes, and is not likely to be used for those purposes in the future, either due to the poor quality of the groundwater or due to the presence of the waste management units. Title 27 requirements prohibit land use on waste management units that might impair their physical integrity, which would preclude well installations on those units. It's also the reason why we don't have data underneath those sites. It's because we don't have monitoring sites over in the units. Okay, so one comment letter was received during the public comment period from Mr. Victor Izzo, a concerned citizen who is also the chief of the mining unit at the board until his retirement last December. Mr. Izzo provided extensive comments, but they can generally be grouped into 5 main categories: compliance with the sources of drinking water policy, groundwater characteristics and the need to differentiate between mine-related impacts versus naturally poor quality groundwater at the site, surface water discharges at the site, compliance with the state anti-degradation policy, and compliance with the state board remand order. Mr. Izzo's comments are summarized in blue and staff's responses in black. Mr. Izzo commented that the designation should be based strictly on the sources of drinking water policy exception criterion of TDS above 3,000 milligrams per liter. So staff evaluated the option of basing groundwater de-designation solely on the TDS exception criterion. In fact, it was one of the alternatives in our staff report. We found that this alternative will not allow Meridian to implement a closure plan in accordance with the remand order. Instead, de-designation is recommended for the area where the groundwater meets that TDS criterion and the area beneath and immediately down gradient of the waste management units. This will be included as a site-specific exception to the sources of drinking water policy. As discussed earlier, the rationale for de-designation included the documented and potential poor quality groundwater underneath some of the waste management units, the past, current, and potential future use of municipal and agricultural supply in the de-designation area, and the Title 27 requirements regarding waste management units. Mr. Izzo commented that more effort should be put into differentiating between mining-related impacts and naturally poor quality groundwater at the RMK mine site. Staff recognizes that differentiation between mining-related impacts and natural conditions was a very significant issue for regulation of the site, and that much work has been done in this regard. However, additional work on differentiation is not needed for this amendment. The remand order recognized that mining activities at the site have impaired and impacted groundwater, and that there are very limited benefits for groundwater treatment. The most reasonable way of managing groundwater at the site is to prevent the impacts from spreading, and additional differentiation of groundwater characteristics is not needed to support this approach. Mr. Izzo also commented that the board should address potential mine-related impacts to surface water and direct Meridian to further investigate the feasibility of using wetlands to treat surface water discharges at the RMK mine site. So staff agrees that any potential mining-related impacts to surface waters must be addressed. However, this is not the process for addressing that or accomplishing that. As stated earlier, the proposed amendment addresses only groundwater at the RMK mine site and is just one part of the overall closure strategy. It is limited to protecting existing groundwater beneficial uses and to preventing impacts to groundwater from spreading. Meridian will be required to comply with updated closure WDRs and with the MPDS permit. These two permits will address all discharges to surface waters at the site. Also, this amendment does not rule out the use of wetlands. Wetlands may still be used if they're found to be an effective treatment for the surface water discharges at the site. In response to Mr. Izzo's comments, staff amended the staff report to clarify and reiterate the scope of the proposed amendment. Mr. Izzo commented that the amendment does not comply with the anti-degradation policy because it does not address springs containing mining waste. Staff disagrees. The amendment is fully consistent with the anti-degradation policy. This basin plan amendment only addresses groundwater beneficial uses, and as discussed earlier, all potential surface water impacts, including potential degradation to surface waters, will be addressed in the revised WDRs and the MPDS permit, and anti-degradation analysis are required as a part of the permitting process. Mr. Izzo commented that this amendment does not comply with the State Board's remand order because it does not address potential surface water discharges, does not require wetlands, nor does it implement what Mr. Izzo interpreted as the order's preferred alternative. Staff developed this amendment specifically to comply with the remand order. However, this amendment is just one part of the overall strategy to close the RMK mine site focused solely on groundwater beneficial uses. Potential surface water discharges and potential use of wetlands will be addressed in the revised closure WDRs and MPDS permit. Mr. Izzo believes that an engineered alternative is the State Water Board's preferred alternative. However, the remand order did not specify a preferred alternative. The amendment followed the remand order's suggested approach of beneficial use de-designation, and instead of a formal containment zone, the amendment includes provisions to ensure that impacts to groundwater do not spread beyond the de-designation area. The Basin Plan Amendment does not require groundwater containment. So there's just one minor late revision to this item. It was posted on our website on Monday of this week, and the board should have copies. The revision is on page 27 of the staff report. A sentence regarding the requirement for the Skyrocket Pit Lake water level was edited to provide clarity. So staff recommends adoption of the proposed Basin Plan Amendment and supplemental environmental documentation. The proposed amendment was developed to comply with the State Board remand order and has a policy element, but is also technically based and scientifically supported. The amendment complies with the remand order by recognizing the site-specific conditions of the RMK mine site and provides a groundwater regulatory framework that allows Meridian not to have to treat the groundwater beneath the dedesignation area. Instead, Meridian will be able to focus on managing the surface water issues, which everyone agrees is the most significant issue at the site. Surface water beneficial uses are not in any way altered by this basin plan amendment and will be continued to be protected at the site. I'd like to now enter this presentation and all of the files into the record and be happy to answer the board's questions at this time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there questions? Thank you very much. Mr. Izzo?
Dr. Longley, can I make I just need to make a comment.
Just a second. Before we go any further, I got to check here. Yes.
I just would like to clarify, because of comments received. When you look at the State Board order on the remand, they spoke a lot to the wetlands issue, which you'll hear Mr. Izzo speak about. And clearly, the board did consider those things, and you'll hear more about that from RMK and the plan and the studies they've done on that. But the order did also provide the regional board alternatives. So I don't want to downplay the fact the State Board did have in their remand order to address wetlands. It's just that that was not the viable alternative for what we're addressing here today, dealing with groundwater.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Mr. Izzo.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chairman Longley, board members. My name is Victor Izzo, and I am a concerned citizen opposed to the Basin Plan Amendment. I would like to make it clear to the board members that do not know me that I worked for the regional board for approximately 28 years and was a senior over the mine site over this mine site for 16. I would also like to note I was not involved in the decision whether the Basin Plan Amendment was appropriate. However, I was a reviewer of the state staff report and to catch inconsistencies in data evaluation and regulatory history. I also like to note that I'll start right here that of all 16 years that I was senior, the board staff never required groundwater pump and treat system because it was impractical, and that we never required liner systems. This presentation, this is my general outline on the presentation, that the this is a groundwater only amendment, and I think that that's an issue right here and there. That being a groundwater only amendment is not the way to go. It also is a groundwater. They talk about is a groundwater containment zone occurring? I believe it is not. What does reclassification mean? What does that actually mean? And I'll get to these things to change this from B to C. What does the state board order require? Alternative solutions to what is proposed here. A real brief thing on responsible parties. I don't want to get into that very much, and a conclusion. Here's an area where there are 3,000 milligrams per liter TDS before mining. So you can see it's not a hodgepodge of data as they proclaim. There is a little spring up here that has high TDS, but besides that, everything else is below 3,000. A good portion is between 500 and 270. Here's what is current at 2008, and I didn't have earlier data. And I want you to note here, again, it has expanded a little. There's been a little bit of contamination from mining down in this area. I also want to note, I went back to the previous slide, is that there was a study done by Royal Mountain King showing the data all around the facility. Again, if you note that, none of these things are over 3,000. It's being used both for municipal and agricultural uses. Here's the groundwater only basin plan amendment appropriate. The issue here is, do you have containment? And one thing I'm going to go through in this portion of my talk is about containment. You can see a line going through Skyrocket Pit. That's going to be a kind of a cartoon that I'm going to show you what occurred here as a cross-section. Here's the original cartoon, because I didn't, have time to do all the data points and put it together. You had groundwater, you had the surface area, which was right here, and the groundwater in general was below. There was some springs. I wouldn't doubt there were some springs on the west side of the fault with salts in it. I'm not debating that, and but on the east side of the fault there was good quality water. RMK started mining. They did Skyrocket Pit. They dewatered that area. It's dry, no cone, no discharge, no surface springs over here in this area. They stopped mining. The water started filling up. It started filling so high they had to build a dam. Now we have groundwater 30 to 40 feet higher than it was previously, because now instead of being in a canyon, it's being backed up behind a dam. That dam raised the water to the elevation of this berm, and also water started springing out when it reached that level at Love Spring and Montour 1830 in that area. The groundwater springs, I better get my glasses. The groundwater springs, Montour 1830, which was in this area here, is now 9 to 12 feet higher, the groundwater elevations, than before mining, causing it to come all the way up to the surface. We also have Love Spring, and once this pit filled up, this spring occurred. This spring was not in existence beforehand. This was a dry area. They did a diversion to go around Skyrocket Pit, and also when the pit started to fill up, the water started coming out down here. Now we're talking, this is a groundwater only amendment, and this is kind of analysis to the filling of the reservoirs. You can't look at the filling of the reservoirs without looking at the snowpack. It's the big picture. It's not just the actual filling, it's the snowpack. Here you can't ignore that we have groundwater containment when we have springs that are generated where the groundwater is coming up out of the ground and being discharged to surface water and going downstream. In fact, this stream down here, which is unnamed, flows year-round now. It used to be an intermittent stream, as you can see from the USGS map here. This USGS map shows this intermittent stream, and it's very small caption basins, very small in this area. And here's where you find Turtle Pond now, full of water, discharging. You find Love Pond, full of water and discharging. And you have the Little Johns Creek diversion. How would this happen if it was previously dry? Here's a picture of an RMK. These, I actually couldn't find the older pictures that were pre-mining, but these oak trees were alive and well. Now they're in a damp area. They don't like having a lot of water in their feet, and they have died because these springs have occurred in an area that was dry before. If you look carefully, you can see the edge of the pit sitting right here, and this is the berm that's on the upgrading side. It's above the level of these springs. Why is this occurring? Again, you have groundwater coming in several directions, hitting Skyrocket Pit with a dam, so the water can't go out in that direction anymore. You have a fault zone, and you have phyllites. The phyllites are relatively tight, and the springs and the greenstone on this side are relatively, well, I would say they're more porous. They have a higher hydraulic conductivity, but they do move water better. And you hit this reservoir, it's mounds up, and the water springs out the backside. The other thing is that we're de-designating a large area that is currently fairly good quality. Flotation telling reservoir, the monitoring wells around it have TDS at 370, 390, 460, 270, and 860. Before mining, this was 375. And they're saying that the TDS there's probably poor quality water under that. Based on what? Right now, what you're probably having in that site is the groundwater is up against the bottom of the unit, preventing the water from leaking. Also, that's our only line facility. It is a line facility. You do have some degradation farther down, and I think you do have to do the forensics to determine whether it's mine waste or not. The board staff in previous years did do that forensics and found that there is a great difference between what's mining waste and what's natural salt constituents. The natural salt, which is over here in the west, under the western ODS, has very high sodium and chloride. The contamination over here is very high in sulfate, which is part of the mineralization, exposing the rock to air and then dissolving into water. So so if we do this amendment and now we're going to reclassify this, what does that mean? Dedesignated groundwater benefit uses would allow reclassification of mining waste from Group B to C, because now they're saying it's no longer a threat, it's only a Group C waste. And as Sue told you earlier, Group B waste has to do with soluble constituents. Group C mining waste is only threats turbidity. So reclassification would allow the permanent release of high salt mining water to groundwater and surface water. The surface water is going to the delta directly and it's causing contamination. So over here at the flotation tailing reservoir, now this is Group C waste. We could release the leachate. We can also not deal with any runoff in this section and be, you know, basically let it go. It's turbidity only. And there is no turbidity issue at this site. This would allow you to let Love Spring flow and also allow Turtle Pond to flow. Neither one of these are captured by the NPDES permit that's down here. What did the State Water Board Order 204007 conclude? It concluded it is appropriate to consider engineered alternatives, closure requirements for RMK, and alternative remedial measures for the water quality impacts of RMK mine. This order directs the petitioner to consult with the regional board and prepare a plan. There is no plan at this time, no complete plan, to develop expanded wetlands and riparian areas downgrade of RMK mine. The facility, in order to promote natural attenuation and phytoremediation, elevated levels of TDS and heavy metals. So none of that's in place. And can I have about 2 more minutes?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The plan for development of expanding wetlands and riparian areas should include appropriate monitoring and waste management procedures to prevent the accumulation of arsenic or other hazardous constituents in a manner that would adversely affect the beneficial uses of water downstream and develop a wetland. We don't have any of that right now. Furthermore, it concludes that, you know, the closure that is consistent with applicable laws. And again, it doesn't seem to do that either. It also says in the footnote connected to that, developing a revised approach to mine closure should focus on reducing the actual impacts to water quality in a cost-effective manner and according to the policies of the Water Code Section 1300, applicable provisions of the Basin Plan, and the State Board policies regarding cleanup and abatement of discharges to previously created conditions, State Board Resolution 9249. Again, we're doing all this beforehand, you're doing the Basin Plan amendment before we do this, and this is what the board order required. It also required petitioners shall prepare and submit a plan for the expanded wetlands and the repairing and downgrading of RNK facility. Again, this is not being done. And the phytoremediation of elevated levels of TDS, sulfate, and heavy metals. The proposal for terminating this recirculation of water flowing from the overburden area to disposal sites restored surface flows in the channels across the pit lake. Again, they're not stopping the recirculation, they're continuing the recirculation by putting this in the pit. And the following review and consideration of the petitioner's plan for establishment of expanded and enhanced wetlands and riparian area. The regional board shall revise the mine closure WDRs established in the closure WDRs order for 5014 based on the considerations of information, petitioner's plans, and other relevant evidence.
Thank you.
Okay. So one thing, there's just too much water going on this site. We need to deal with that water before it goes down gradient. So I did have a solution that they could do and add wetlands and to comply with state board order.
Right. You submitted comments, so, and that's been addressed. Any questions or comments? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Skip Spalding for Meridian Bear Track.
Good afternoon. My name is Skip Spalding. I'm a lawyer with Farella, Braun & Martel in San Francisco. I represent Meridian. I've worked on the site for many years. I'm joined today by two other people. I have Adam Whitman, who is the president of Meridian Bear Track, and Dr. Tom Patterson, who will be making a presentation, in a moment. I'm only going to take a minute to talk about the legal framework for this amendment, and then Dr. Patterson will give a very short technical presentation. 2 months from now will be the 10-year anniversary of the State Board's remand order. It's been a long and arduous process. There have been a lot of studies, a lot of staff time, a lot of Meridian time, a lot of consultant time, some lawyer time involved in working through the various potential approaches for achieving closure of the mine. A lot of good ideas were brought up and rejected for good reasons, and I think the main point is that what we've got today is the culmination of a very thoughtful, very careful process that occurred completely in accordance with what the State Board envisioned when it issued its remand order. In our opinion, the proposed amendment here today complies in all respects with the State Board remand order. There was no preferred alternative. What the State Board said was, look at this variety of things, try and come up with an alternative approach that fully complies with all of the different laws. And this amendment, in fact, does that. Secondly, the proposed amendment is based on a very firm technical foundation based on the successful groundwater management strategy that's been implemented at the site for the last 6 to 8 years. So it has a very firm and well scientifically supported factual foundation that I think bodes very well for its success. The proposed amendment also fully protects the water resources of all the neighboring properties. And most importantly, the amendment provides the necessary legal framework for the closure of the site to occur. It just creates the framework. There are further steps that need to be accomplished, but it is a very important component, in fact, the cornerstone for the closure of the site. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Patterson, and all of us are available for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tom Patterson. I work for SLR International. I'm a consultant to Meridian Bear Track. I've been working on this site since 1994. That's 20 years. I think, forgive me, Dr. Longley, but you're the only one who's been working on this as long as I have.
You have about 6.5 minutes left, so you're going to have to hit the high points.
Right. So, as Skip said, there's a lot of studies, a lot of things have happened in the last 20 years. A lot of progress have been made. This is the crux, a cornerstone to our regulatory framework. It's very important that we get this regulatory framework in place so that we can complete the closure. I wanted to cover several sort of redirect type of topics that are based on Mr. Izzo's recent comments. One was that there is no sulfate in the phyllite water. This table comes from a 1996 closure plan. I know it's hard to see, but the highlighted column shows that here the sulfate concentrations are quite elevated, 2,000, 3,000 parts per million, and that's pre-project data. So it has always been sulfate. The pit and creek relationship, this, well, the groundwater management strategy we have shows this conceptual hydrogeologic model. There's a waste pile shown there. This is drawn to scale. There's infiltration through the top of the waste pile, and there's groundwater seepage rising up under the waste pile, and it comes out because of the low permeability at the salt spring slate, the phyllite material. And we collect that water, and we store it in the Skyrocket Pit Lake, as shown in this schematic. There's 3 seeps, and the FTR water we collect and we put in the pit lake, and we discharge under the NPDES permit to control the pit lake level. The pit lake level is controlled. We have a very good water balance model that projects water levels, and the spill level is 972. You can see our projection shows that we keep it very low, and we have been keeping it very low, and that our model is accurate. This is an important photo that shows a lot of different things. This was early in the development of the mine, about 1990. This area here is Skyrocket Pit before it was a pit. This is the Little Johns Creek diversion. This is the former Little Johns Creek. And this area here is an archaeologic exploration. They found a Native American encampment there that had been, they studied intensely. It showed that there was continuous inhabitation of the site for over 9,000 years, and the archaeologists said it was for 2 reasons. One was because of salt, and one was because it always has water. So there is always water and springs coming up here. You can see this is the dry season. This photo was taken early in the summer. There's water in the Little Johns Creek diversion, and that's evidence that there was dry season flow in Little Johns Creek. You can also see water in the bottom of the pit lake. This shows pre-project and during project and post-project TDS concentrations in Little Johns Creek. You can see that pre-project, the concentrations in the creek bed were very high. During mining, when there was pit dewatering, the poor quality water that used to rise into the creek bed no longer rose there. It was collected by the mine and used for mining processes. And then afterwards, the pit was filling, and once it was filled, we started to see elevated TDS again, nowhere near as high as it was before, but it is a return to a baseline condition. This is drawn to scale also. This shows the diversion channel over here. Pre-mine, water flowed into the pit lake area. It came out of the surface as springs. During mining, the pit was excavated and the pit was dewatered. And then post-mine, this is what it looks like, and the dam is over here. It's not that high. I mean, it is 40 feet, but the pit is very deep. And the diversion channel gets water that used to flow into the creek. It can't go into the pit lake. It doesn't go into the pit lake anymore. It rises into the diversion channel. The last thing we've done, or the second to last thing, we've done a lot of water quality evaluations. This one's for Love Pond Spring. It was submitted in 2007. We've submitted similar reports subsequent to this as required by WDRs and according to the NPDES permit requirements. This one shows that Love Pond Spring, The Piper charts show that variability of geochemistry of water and similarities of different types of water. This shows Love Pond spring water, which was when Victor was talking about, versus creek water, which is SWM10, and versus North Pit water. What this doesn't show is that North Pit water, which is a pit lake, has a much lower, it's about a third of the concentration of TDS that the Love Pond spring does, but it's a very similar type of water, as opposed to the FTR water and FTR ODS water, which is this water, this water, this water, and this water. And another important feature of this Piper chart is that there is a wide scatter of all the points that are plotted, and that's an indication of heterogeneity of the water types and also the water quality. So finally, the wetlands. Shortly after the remand order, if I might have 2 more minutes too.
You'll get 2 minutes and that's it.
Okay. I'll take one. And shortly after the remand order, we prepared a supplemental closure plan that was based on wetlands treatment systems, and the entire report was treating water with wetlands to reduce sulfate and to control the waters at the site. And we got, this was in 2004, the board staff sent us back to the drawing board because we didn't have any evidence that it would work. So we did some testing. We tested this wetlands treatment system using a variety of substrates commonly used. Golder Associates performed it. They do these tests all the time. Jim Gusick, who's probably well known to this board. The results showed that this is a plot of influent versus effluent of the different seeps that we control. The seeps have varying TDS concentrations from 6,000 to 10,000, and you can see that the best reduction in electrical conductivity, which is a proxy for TDS, that we ever got was about 20% reduction. So based on this, we determined that it wasn't going to work because this is a TDS problem at this site, and we abandoned using wetlands at that point. That's all I have to say. If you have any questions.
Thank you very much. An interesting slide. Any questions or comments? I have a card from Stacy Griffith.
Hello, my name is Stacy McCarty Griffith. I live on Rock Creek Road in Salt Spring Valley. My family has lived and ranched near the Royal Mountain King mine since 1852. I am very familiar with the property where the mine is located, as our family has grazed cattle there for several years. Before my father's passing in 2002, he was very involved with the construction of the mine and had the utmost respect for them not only as a mine site, but also as a friend. We live upgrade of the mine, so therefore their activity could not have affected our groundwater, but for years we've had bad water trouble. We have a well that became very salty and the more we used it. And I know of at least 2 other salty wells upgrade of the mine. One is on the Llewellyn Ranch located northwest of the mine, and the other is on the Tower Ranch located north of the mine. The salty water is because we live in Salt Spring Valley, not because of the mine. I feel Meridian has always done an excellent job informing the public about their production and now closure. Meridian has been a good neighbor from day one. They have shown great integrity, honesty, and they have lived up to every promise made. So therefore, I feel the mine should be allowed closure as is. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you for your testimony. Closing statement by staff.
So first, I just want to say that this basin plan amendment does not reclassify the overburn. It's one component of it. It's a groundwater component. Reclassification would be decided during the update of the closure WDRs, and at that point, you can look at possible surface water impacts. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. And, you know, I know Victor's worked on the site for a long time, and he's really passionate about it, and like he was about all of his work here, and that's what made him so effective. it's understandable that he wants to see all the issues resolved, right? Surface water and groundwater, we all do. However, that was never the purpose of this basin plan amendment. The contract for this amendment clearly stated we were to look at groundwater beneficial uses at the site and de-designate the beneficial uses that were not appropriate. And that's what we're doing. You know, Victor would like to see all the details of the future surface water management at the site to be addressed in this amendment. That was never our task, nor would it be appropriate to put those details in a basin plan amendment. The appropriate time and place to resolve the surface water issues is during the revision of the closure WDRs, and if necessary, the NPDES permit. Of course, we know that groundwater is directly linked to surface water. However, there are different regulations that come into play, and there are different regulatory programs. And, you know, as I mentioned a number of times during the presentation, this amendment is just one part of the overall closure strategy, and it is to address the groundwater beneath and immediately down gradient of those waste management units. This is going to remove the need for Meridian to treat groundwater in that area, and so they can focus on the surface water issues. Surface water beneficial uses are not affected whatsoever by this basin plan amendment and will continue to be fully impacted, or protected, I'm sorry. So I urge that you adopt the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
All right.
Pamela, do you have a closing statement?
I think Ken does. I don't know if we want.
Not a
and I have a
statement,
couple things to say
recommendation.
too.
A recommendation.
Yeah, we haven't coordinated all these various closing statements, but a couple things. And I wouldn't say that anything Victor said is a surprise, but I do want to point out a couple things. The board has certainly heard how effective wetlands have been at treating mine discharges, but those are predominantly the acid mine drainage discharges. It can be very good at neutralizing pH. It can be very good at reducing metals. You've seen some very excellent results from some of the mines up in the Redding area. This is not acid mine drainage. This is not a heavy metals problem, and we worked quite a bit with Meridian on the wetland studies, and it just wasn't penciling out as, you know, getting much improvement. We're certainly aware of the groundwater elevation changes and the springs out into the creek. That is one of the reasons that for the NPDES permit to lower the level of the groundwater so you do not have the springs popping out into the creek, because what's happening with the springs to the creek is that salts are going to the creek at any time of the year. Lower the groundwater. That same salt may be going to the creek, but it is going at a time when there is assimilative capacity and can move out of the system. I'd love to be able to contain everything there, but we just don't know how to do that. In regards to the 3,000 TDS in the groundwater, we're certainly well aware of that. There are certain areas that Sue had shown that are above 3,000, and it's clear we can de-designate that under the rules in the sources of drinking water policy. But the sources of drinking water policy also allows us to do site-specific. And so for much of the site, we're doing that. Some areas are very good quality. Some of them, if you'd had a chance to actually look at the details on Victor's slide, some of them are under 3,000, but they're 2,800 or something. There's nothing that magic about 3,000 in terms of the beneficial use, but it is a number of great significance in terms of how you apply the sources of drinking water problem. So we're talking about closure of a site, and closure of a site, would be it a mine or a landfill, does not mean that the discharge is done and walking away. It just means they're done with the active stuff. We figured out how to deal with it on the long run. Title 27 requires certain things to be done for closure. This, again, as I said when I started out, should not have been an unlined land situation, so it doesn't fit Title 27 well. If we don't do this or something equivalent, the discharger will have to be continuing to look at liners, treatment, characterization of the groundwater. We've spent a lot of time with Meridian working on the details of what groundwater is from what sources, what's caused it. We can continue that for a really long time, but one reason we went along the basin plan route is because we saw no beneficial outcome to continuing to study the groundwater in that kind of detail that didn't lead back to the same thing we're proposing right now. And we don't want to spend our time, and I don't think it makes sense for Meridian to spend their time continuing to figure out all the geologic details out there. I think this will be protective of groundwater quality, along with the other two things that aren't on the table today. And again, I'm recommending also adoption with a late revision. So.
Thank you, Ken. Close the hearing, and what we have in front of us is a basin plan with amendments. A basin plan amendment with, I should say, late changes. So, what's your pleasure? Discussion, or I'll entertain a motion. It's late in the day, I know.
Well, I was going to say that I came in here really looking for an answer to Mr. Izzo's concerns, because given his background, I think that he has, expertise and valid points. So, I did come in sort of expecting staff to address the issues. And I feel like the explanation that I've gotten from staff and from Mr. Landau, satisfy me. And I know that staff, in the past, certainly having had someone like Mr. Izzo, is no slouch when it comes to deciding when it's time to take a step, and they wouldn't have done it if they thought that there was another way. So, even though I thought Mr. Izzo's points were well taken, I would make a motion that we approve let me see what it's called exactly. I would move to approve the amendment to the water quality control plan.
With recommended changes. Yeah.
With the late revisions.
It's a resolution.
The resolution with the late revision.
Yeah.
Right. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, we'll go to voting. This is a voice vote, and I have a statement to make after it. All in favor of the motion say so by saying aye. Aye. Opposed say no. Abstentions? Thank you. Victor, for a long time, you were a very valued and important member of the staff here, and I challenged staff, and as Pamela and Ken can attest to, when I saw your recommendations and I saw what staff was recommending. It spent considerable time. I have to think, and I could well be wrong, that if you'd been here in the midst of it, you might be coming, given the multi-step process that we're in, you might have come to a different conclusion. But I fully respect everything that you've done for the board in the past, and thank you once again for the very valuable service you've given to us. So,
Short statement out about this.
Sure.
I just want to know, there's disagreements, and I, like Tom, Adam, and Spike, Skip, I'm sorry, Skip. We worked great. They're good people. But the main thing I want to say is, I had almost 28 years here, and I loved it, and I loved the board, and I loved the board system. It's one reason why I never left, like to DTSC, where there's very centralized and all that, because here you really got a chance to have a public statement, and the public was involved, and we got to hear from everybody. And I just want to thank everybody and all the staff over here, the management, and Sue has always been a great friend, and all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for your service. With that, I saw some people wander back into the room.
Yes, we were able to come up with some language we're going to be distributing to Patrick.
Okay, we will move
Patrick
back.
And
we'll move back to
members.
item 24. Yes, Mr.
So,
Good. Give us a minute while we get oriented here. Yeah, I know. I was thinking too. In fact, we'll take a 5-minute recess. Be back here about 23 after. Patrick,
I'm set. I think I'm gonna have to do this more often. Just hand it over to staff and Alex, who maybe had a pair of fresh eyes. But I think we've come up with some language, or they've come up with some language that I'm definitely fine with. Have a chance to review it. I think it's in front of you, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
And it's also on the screen. So there were two areas where we made changes in the resolution. One is in the actual amendment language with the, under the monitoring for municipal stormwater and domestic wastewater monitoring. And so as instructed, we deleted number 2 and made some changes to number 3, which is now number 2, consistent with what was recommended.
And if the board would like to tinker any more, they'd be more than welcome.
Well,
but
I have a question.
that's off the record. Your mic was.
Tess, does this, I get a thumbs up? Do I get the other thumbs up? Good. Well, that'd indicate that all those who've testified are given thumbs up.
And
Good.
the other place that we proposed some late revisions was up on in the resolution findings themselves. The new finding that was already a late revision, we've got some additional changes to that as well, referring to irrigated lands monitoring.
Okay, thank you. So Debbie and Tess and, I'm sorry, sir, yes, have indicated that they are comfortable with the wording. Mr. Ruby, yes. And with that, do I have a motion?
I move with were there late?
There were late.
I know they're late, but were there late as well?
Was
there a late revision?
There
Okay,
was
so-
one late one, and then there's the ones on the screen.
Okay, so I move with the late and the late revisions.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second. I say that I'm impressed with being able to fix a problem like this,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, with everybody. So
Yeah.
thanks to everybody. It's just really
Oh,
impressive.
we got some good people we're working with. With that said, I believe this is a voice vote, or is this a roll call vote?
It's a voice vote. The resolution will both approve the supplemental documents and approve the basin plan amendment.
Thank you. We'll go ahead with a voice vote. All in favor of the motion to approve the amendment with the late revision, state so by saying aye. Opposed, say no. Abstentions? Motion carries.
Just to clarify, that was the resolution that.
Yes, the motion for the approval of the resolution.
Yes.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Attorney. And with that, we stand adjourned till the next regularly scheduled meeting of this board. Am I correct? In Reading.
Yeah, in Reading on the 14th and 15th of May. 15th and 16th of May in Reading. It'll be a board workshop, not a board hearing.
Before you leave,